The night permeated through the loose curtains, timidly painting the room in deep blue. The heroine felt a warmth enveloping her like a light cloud and stretched, waking up in a warm bed. And cozy. But today, she wasn't alone in bed, and wondered if her friends were still drinking. Although it was good that they hadn't abandoned her anywhere. A man's hand was on her shoulder, and at that moment, she heard a pleasant voice asking if the lady was really going to sleep after bringing him to such a state. The heroine remembered that the night before she had been drinking with her friends, and they had really gotten so drunk that they had completely lost their voices. The lady hadn't opened her eyes yet. She listened attentively to the voice as if it came from a romantic drama. The stranger pinched her cheek, and she didn't know his name or how she ended up in bed with him. The girl simply said, half asleep, that the voice didn't suit her at all, and that it was time to stop fooling around. She still hadn't opened her eyes, not understanding why this man was paying attention to her every word. The heroine opened her eyes and froze in amazement next to her. On a wrinkled sheet in the gloom of dawn, a man lay. Not just a man, he is the embodiment of strength and beauty, as if descended from the canvases of ancient gods. He woke up, stretching gently like a big wild cat, and his gaze involuntarily stopping at her bare chest. It made her cheeks flush with a delicate blush. Panic seized her like a tidal wave. She frantically tried to recall the events of the previous night, desperately clinging to fragments of consciousness, but her memory was treacherously silent. His broad shoulders, covered only by a piece of blanket, his muscular back, disappearing into the shadows. But who is he, and how did he end up here? The dark room, lit by candles, was completely devoid of any memory of the previous night's events. There was definitely a half-naked man lying next to the heroine, and she was wearing only a modest nightgown. She didn't even dare to ask questions, but this situation gave her bad thoughts. Panic grew. The girl was invaded by fear of the unknown and the sudden surge of feelings. The young man said that the previous night the girl had attacked him and even undressed him. But the heroine didn't usually get that drunk. From the stranger's face, it was clear that he was not at all upset by what happened, and that everything was perfectly fine for him. The embarrassed heroine understood that she couldn't leave it like that and apologized to the stranger. Suddenly, he grabbed her hand, confessing once more that everything was fine and that he had no complaints. She looked into his eyes with a confused and frightened look, as the young man told her that he had enjoyed the previous night. Holding his hand on her chest, he also suggested that they continue, because everything happening between them was incredible. The heroine was so surprised that she couldn't even say a word, and whispered to him what was going to continue. He pushed her away from the edge of the bed, fearing the girl might fall, but now she just wanted him not to come closer. The heroine's heart pounded hard, like a bird trapped in a cage, and her breath was ragged with horror and surprise. Her hands desperately clutched the blanket, trying to create at least some kind of barrier between them, at least some illusion of protection. She tried to scream, but fear oppressed her throat, and instead of screaming, she only let out a weak hiss. His gaze, which pierced her completely, seemed like a death sentence to her. She didn't know what to expect, what she would do. Suddenly, he called her Liana and asked if everything unnecessary was fine, because the previous night she behaved differently. But the moment the girl realized it wasn't Liana at all. Some people burst into the room. The young people's eyes widened in amazement, and unable to do anything, they quickly moved between the couple in bed and the rest of the company. They called him Your Majesty. At that moment the heroine got scared. She really was in a foreign country and had clearly drunk too much the day before. In short, the girl suddenly woke up in someone else's body, in a completely unfamiliar place. It turned out that she was the daughter of a viscount, a famous man named Liana Daphne, and the dark-haired young man sleeping next to her in bed was Enoch Philip de Hart. And it seemed he was the emperor of this country. It all seemed like incredible nonsense, because only a madman could have imagined such a scenario. Siliana understood everything correctly. She found herself inside a romance novel she was reading, with an equally absurd title. Why was the young lady wandering in the rose garden? The content of the novel was so explicit that she couldn't even finish reading it. But if she had known she would end up there, she would have read it to the end. Enoch was explaining for the 5th time. The girl suddenly burst into his room and climbed into his bed and even undressed, saying she was hot. The young man certainly wasn't worried about this, but Liana, hearing this, was ready to sink to the floor. Last night, she climbed into the emperor's bed, and this information alone would be enough for her to be beheaded and executed. As far as the emperor knew, Liana loved to drink, but this in no way affected her memory, admitting that it was time for the girl to stop drinking. Liana looked in the mirror and saw her own reflection, a completely different woman than she was. With bright blonde hair and light green eyes, she was the cousin of the protagonist. Her double, Liana, is a typical villainess, who appears at the beginning of the story only to die tragically. She is incredibly fond of money, thirsty for power, and is also the most hardened drunkard in the empire. Liana was almost sure that the heroine had been trying to seduce the emperor, dreaming all her life of becoming empress and gaining the power she desired. But she was a completely different person, and Liana's shady past worried her incredibly now. From nervousness, she even started biting her hair, but the emperor said that hair was definitely not food. He even offered to bring some food, as the girl was probably hungry, but she was still frantically messing with her hair. She looked closely at the young man and realized that this was the same emperor from the novel. But he didn't look like a tyrant at all. According to the novel's plot, Emperor Enoch was pedantic and clean, and was the only character who never had physical contact with the protagonist. Anyone who touched him was punished mercilessly, and for this, he was nicknamed the Mad Tyrant. He dismissed his servants for accidentally touching him, and a maid could be fired just for brushing against him accidentally. The emperor also exiled people just for keeping their distance without observing the rules. And every time the story reached the point of explicit scenes, the character, with all the labels, categorically refused and seemed like an impenetrable wall. At that moment, Liana realized that she had also touched him, and that meant she would also be exiled or executed on the first day of entering the novel. Suddenly, Enoch asked the girl if she had forgotten her wish, but Liana couldn't remember any of it. He suggested seeing a doctor if it was so serious, and the girl forgot everything after last night. And she really doesn't remember that she proposed touching him herself last night. Liana knew that the emperor was not allowed to touch him, but now he was interested in checking something, and he asked the girl to touch him again. The problem is that every time she touched him, her body felt completely normal. He unbuttoned his shirt, confessing that it was the key to the most important mystery. And last night, he believed that this girl was the one who could heal him forever. The emperor asked the girl to touch his chest, because that was exactly what he wanted, while the heroine didn't understand what she had done before entering her. She saw bold features, a visibly exposed chest, and only black gloves on the emperor's hands. This was his real taste, and although Ileana saw it for the first time today, all of this was driving her crazy. Be that as it may, the heroine firmly decided that she needed to get out of there immediately, stating that she was not feeling well and that she would touch the emperor on another occasion. She simply felt a cold sweat drenching her. The emperor noticed that the lady's facial muscles were tense, and she didn't seem well. Enoch even suggested calling a famous palace doctor, who specializes in treating alcoholism. Liana promised to handle it herself, and decided to leave the room as quickly as possible. She gave the emperor a strained smile, declaring that she was leaving right now, and that she would find her own way out. The heroine decided that as soon as she left the imperial palace, she needed to find a ship to sail away secretly. Who knows? When that tyrant Enoch changes his mind and goes crazy, he will definitely try to find her again. The heroine ran to the door, but suddenly stopped abruptly near it, and the emperor asked her what was wrong. Liana realized that she only had one question left, and she had absolutely no answer for it. She asked the emperor if he knew where her home was, and the question sounded even stupider than her amnesia from the night before. She managed to get home, and the next morning Liana felt incredibly exhausted, and she asked the maid to bring her some water. The maid brought the lady a glass, and she started drinking the contents in one gulp, thanking her for her attention. The next second, Liana spat everything out onto the bed, although the maid admitted that this is what the lady always drinks in the morning. There was alcohol in the glass, and the lady was confused about who drinks alcohol in the morning right after waking up. The maid said that Lady Liana does this all the time, and it's true, because she was in someone else's body. At least she was glad she made it home safely, but now her life had drastically changed. Perhaps she was worth thanking the emperor for his help, and he was truly scared when Liana said she had forgotten where her house was. Gratitude was one thing, but avoiding perverts was the key to survival, and she decided to stay away from him. She decided to ask the maid if she hadn't said anything else when they said goodbye yesterday. Someone knocked on the door, but the maid wasn't expecting visitors, and the heroine felt like she was missing something important. Just before getting into the carriage yesterday, she remembered that the emperor whispered something in her ear and asked her to touch him the next time they met. As soon as she remembered this, her eyes widened even more in surprise, and Liana just sighed deeply. She jumped out of bed to prevent the maid from opening the door, and she knew perfectly well who was outside. The voice behind the door said that they had agreed to finish their conversation in the bedroom last night, and those words sounded ambiguous. No matter how you look at it, the emperor asking her to touch him seems completely unacceptable. Anyone would have misinterpreted these words, and even the maid looked at the door apprehensively when the emperor shouted. Lena had surpassed herself. If this door opens, the girl will have to submit to the tyrant's perverted whims, and finally touch his bare chest, which she definitely didn't want. Therefore, the heroine had only one way out. She saw an open window, and without thinking, she climbed onto it. The heroine hadn't even had her first kiss, and now she was trapped in a crazy love story. And she didn't want to become the next victim of a perverted despot. Luckily, the window wasn't very high. Liana shouted to the maid. The emperor was standing outside the door, and asked her if he came in to say that Liana was not there. Or better yet, to say that she got drunk, lost consciousness, and died. In front of the maid, Liana jumped out the window, and her actions were simply shocking. Just then, the emperor entered the room, and asked the maid if the lady was not in her bedroom. He went out onto the balcony and began calling Liana out loud, who was trying not to breathe. Standing below, among the bushes under the balcony, she hoped that if she sat there for a while, the emperor would probably leave, and they almost caught her now. Liana sat among the blooming rose bushes and hoped the emperor had already come down, and that his voice was definitely coming from above. Suddenly, next to the bushes, she saw a child's shoe, and it was definitely a little child's foot. But now the lady was more concerned that if the noise continued, the emperor would notice, and she asked the baby to play somewhere else. The girl turned and looked at the little girl, while trying with gestures to show her as best she could that the girl should not say anything. As soon as she saw Liana, she immediately became incredibly happy, and Liana just didn't want anyone to make any noise. She looked at the unknown little girl with delighted eyes, not understanding why she was looking at her so intently. And for some reason, at that very moment, the little girl, with incredibly happy eyes, raised her arms and began to crawl towards Liana. It was as if this child knew this girl very well, and her smile widened even more. Looking closely at the baby, Liana clearly noticed that this child was her miniature copy. The heroine couldn't understand what was happening there, but she clearly saw in front of her a little girl who looked like two peas in a pod like her. In the world of this novel, blonde hair and green eyes are quite rare, and only Liana and Elisha possessed this combination. She tried to figure out who the baby was, and maybe it was Liana's little sister. But she was too young to be her sister. The lady even suggested that maybe it was her little niece, but for some reason, the little one called her mommy. She took the child in her arms, trying to understand who she was, and at that moment the emperor appeared behind her. While Liana was trying to figure out who this little girl was, she completely forgot that she had run away from the emperor. He said he thought the girl was in her room, and noticed that there was a little child sitting in her arms. Liana admitted that she didn't remember anything at all, and that she had only met the baby a couple of minutes ago. But her hair color was exactly the same as hers. They were exactly the same, with huge emerald green eyes and blonde hair. The emperor was stunned by what happened and asked Liana not to say what she certainly didn't expect to hear now. And above all, he didn't expect the girl to have a little child, although Liana herself didn't know either. Liana declared that she wasn't even married and where she had a child. Liana was a supporting character, but the heroine clearly remembered that she was free, unless she was hiding her real child all along, who for some reason was sitting in her arms and calling her mommy. After these words, there was surprise, and just now the little girl said the word mom. The young lady timidly directed her attention to the young man next to her, who sparked her interest. She extended her small, chubby fingers and probably wanted to tell the stranger something. While the stunned emperor didn't understand anything, the little girl reached out her hand to him and called him loudly daddy. And at that moment, Liana almost went crazy and drops of cold sweat ran down her face. But she wasn't the only one confused, and the emperor, who was nearby, was also looking at Liana with surprised eyes. And full of shame, the heroes entered the living room to try to clear up the situation, and Liana carefully held the child in her arms. She decided to find out if Enoch was absolutely sure that this was not his son. And unlike her, The young man perfectly remembered the previous night. It was physically impossible. They had only met yesterday, but now Liana wanted to know why the little girl was calling mommy. And the emperor daddy. Enoch also didn't understand anything, saying he knew nothing, although before he had said he saw the baby for the first time. Looking at the little girl, Liana realized more and more that this girl was incredibly similar to her. The emperor couldn't understand why Liana had a child at home and why she acted as if she knew nothing. Liana didn't even know where her house was, and now she didn't recognize the little inhabitant of her own mansion at all. The young man was horrified and wondered if she drank so much that she didn't even recognize her own child. It all seemed like nonsense. The emperor asked her not to worry. The former chancellor suffered from a similar ailment. As soon as he stopped drinking, he felt much better. Liana tried to convince the emperor that she was not a drunkard, and at that moment, the butler rushed into the room. He confessed that he was afraid the baby had disappeared, but the maid informed him that she should be there. He greeted the emperor, who had arrived unannounced, while Liana couldn't guess who the man was. But now there was something more important. It seemed that the butler knew very well about this child, and now he was the one taking care of him. The emperor immediately asked if this little girl was Liana's daughter and who she was. The butler admitted that the emperor had misunderstood everything. The lady wasn't even married, and how it was possible for her to have a child. He said that recently, Liana personally brought a baby here, and she really didn't remember anything about it. Clearly something was happening here, and Liana looked at the butler with stunned eyes. And she stayed to find out what the original Liana had done. The little girl was surprised. She hadn't told the neighbor whose child it was. The butler replied that the lady had never mentioned it, and that she had been sleeping since her arrival, while the servants were terribly worried. He also brought the baby's first toy, and now felt stupid because he didn't offer to feed the little lady. The pensive lady dismissed the servant so he could go to the kitchen and bring food for the child. Liana wondered if the little girl had been brought here with a toy, so she definitely had a father and a guardian. Looking closely at the little one, she noticed a ribbon sewn onto the toy with the name Ariel. After the butler left, Enoch sighed deeply and stood up from the sofa. The lady stated that now the young man was probably convinced that she was not his mother, and that her head was completely in order. She noticed the young man's agitated face as his expression changed after this conversation. The gentleman apologized, realizing that, with all his accusations, he had gone too far. And in fact, it was the first time he had experienced something like this, and simply didn't know how to behave correctly. Liana immediately noticed the somewhat such words, not understanding the meaning of his words. It turned out that the young man had a peculiarity when he touched Liana. Unlike everyone else, his body reacted differently. The girl looked again at the gentleman's bare chest and remembered those first minutes when she woke up in his bed. And now Enoch looked at the little girl with even greater surprise, because he didn't know who she was. The baby looked at Mr. Enoch and suddenly began to cry loudly in Liana's arms. Her little face wrinkled and large tears streamed from her eyes, leaving wet marks on her cheeks. Liana was surprised because just now the baby was completely fine, but for some reason she was crying loudly throughout the palace now. The heroine asked the young man to button up the top buttons of his shirt so as not to embarrass anyone in the house. Enoch was not used to children's tears and didn't know how to react to them. The silence, broken only by sobs, became unbearable. Liana guessed that the little girl seemed to be very scared, much more than she thought. She grabbed the young man's hand and asked what they should do, because at this rate, the little girl would get even angrier. Enoch had no idea how to calm the little girl, but his head was full of other thoughts. He knew very well that it was inappropriate to say it now. Enoch admitted that he hadn't imagined it at all, and when Liana touched his body, it reacted differently. Suddenly, the girl covered the young man's mouth with her hand and didn't realize that the baby was crying. And Enoch was thinking about that nonsense. Her hand was close to the master's neck. All she wanted to do was pull it quickly, but looking at the young man, she realized curiously that he was now smiling charmingly. And above all, Liana was worried that the gentleman might get angry at any moment. But on the contrary, he was incredibly kind. The baby's crying finally stopped, but an invisible veil of childish sadness still hung in the air. At that moment, the young lady uttered her second word, Daddy, with great emotion, looking directly at Enoch. The little girl was incredibly happy to have managed to say something intelligible, and it was the first time something like this had happened to the young man. Liana noticed that the emperor's face seemed to have some effect on the baby when looking at him. She stopped crying and started laughing. The girl, still sobbing a little, curiously watched his every move. Slowly, very slowly, Enoch covered his eyes with the palms of his hands. Enoch paused, then abruptly opened his eyes and widening them for effect. He said in a low and slightly hoarse voice, "Boo." Liana burst out laughing and admitted that, surprisingly, the little girl was still smiling even after this performance. She praised the young man because he did a great job, and the little girl was probably smiling because she liked handsome people. Just now, Liana herself didn't even realize how she paid the young gentleman a compliment, and she admitted that her words were completely objective. Objective. Enoch had never felt this way before. No one had ever told him he was simply beautiful. As they looked at each other, no one noticed that the little girl reached out and touched the gentleman. No one understood why now, but the little girl suddenly wanted to touch him. Liana was scared because the emperor hated anyone touching him, even if it was just a child. She immediately started defending the little girl because she wasn't doing it out of malice. And she was just a child he shouldn't get angry with. For some reason, the emperor now seemed extremely frightened, and his reaction was quite strange. And at that moment, Liana completely stopped understanding what was happening in that huge room. Suddenly, the young man's hands were covered with frost and began to turn white, emitting an incredible cold. Liana immediately felt, it seemed to her, as if she were standing outside in the snowiest weather. And freezing, she took the master's hands, feeling his icy body, and shouted at him to try to come to his senses. She grabbed his ungloved wrist, because the emperor had said before that his body warmed up when she touched him. The girl's fear and panic grew more and more because the emperor remained silent and didn't answer. Suddenly, he leaned towards her, holding her silky hair in his hands, and asked her to stay with him a little longer. His body slowly began to warm up, and only a touch from Liana helped to break the magical spell. And now Liana was in the middle of her house, hugging the emperor, until the magical cold around him stopped dissipating. The young man didn't hide it, and told about the cursed magic if he touched anyone other than Liana. His body would be covered in ice. But Liana was the first to touch him, and for some reason the curse didn't react to her touch. And now finally, the heroine realized what the young man had in mind. They now felt an awkward situation. Each of them thought something completely different. Enoch said that quite some time had passed since his body stopped feeling the warmth of another person. He understood that his actions had probably embarrassed the young lady and sincerely apologized for them. But finally in his life, he discovered that it seemed Liana was the only girl who could free him from the curse. The heroine never expected to hear that on the first day of her rebirth, she would find out that she would be able to save the emperor from a terrible curse. While the heroes were talking, they completely forgot that there was still a small child in that room. Turning around, they saw the little girl walking alone on the floor, carrying a heavy toy in her hands. Her joyful childish cries echoed throughout the room as she held a huge teddy bear in front of her. She probably decided to show the beautiful toy to the emperor because he definitely hadn't seen it. The sincere eyes of the little girl looked directly at the gentleman, and he wondered if she had really decided to give him a toy. It was incredibly sweet. Liana offered the young man to take her and pretend to be incredibly happy. The first thing she feared was that if she touched the toy, she would probably also be engulfed by the snow curse. Enoch stared intently at the snowflakes, gently swirling around his palm. But he decided to simply not touch the baby and carefully took the toy with his gloves, cheerfully thanking the little girl. He carefully took the teddy bear, and it was the first time in his life that he felt such joy. The little girl mumbled something incoherent, and he feared that this was truly how she wanted to apologize to him. Because judging by her face, the girl was clearly worried about something. But for now she couldn't say anything and only frowned. The emperor continued to look excitedly at the young lady, who was trying with all her might to show him something. Liana also couldn't understand what was happening, but the baby wasn't crying, but rather really wanted to apologize for something. Perhaps she thought she had hurt the emperor with her sudden touch. The emperor immediately told the girl that she shouldn't feel guilty, and he simply scared her a lot. He even happily declared that he already felt much better than before, and that everything was perfectly fine with him. Liana was delighted when the little one finally realized that everything was truly fine with the master. At that moment, a butler appeared in the room, preparing food for the baby and some snacks for the guest. But when he saw a beautiful couple with a child, he immediately thought he had arrived at the wrong time. The butler ran out of the room, confessing that under no circumstances would he disturb the lady unexpectedly again. When the right moment came, Liana decided to ask the emperor a question that worried her. How did it happen that, for many years, the young man has been suffering from a terrible magical curse and lives a completely different life? He managed to calmly touch the toy, and this curse probably has many features. Enoch decided to tell his story, and that a piece of ice was trapped in his heart. As soon as he touches another person, the piece of ice gets out of control and begins to freeze his body. Liana was incredibly curious how the magical fragment ended up right in his heart. Imagine her surprise when the young man confessed that he himself had placed the fragment in his heart. This was even stranger, because the young man had condemned himself to such an unhappy life. Once his body started freezing, nothing could melt it, so there was nothing left to do but wait for everything to simply calm down. He supposed that the girl's family probably possessed the power of fire, and by touching her, his body began to warm up quickly. By feeling this warmth, the young man was not only able to stop the curse for a short time, but also felt much better, and he supposed that at this rate it was possible that soon he might melt, somehow, that cursed piece of ice. After hearing his opinion, Liana thought for a while and admitted that perhaps the emperor had confused something. In this world there were special powers: fire, ice, and wind, and other powers that control these elements. Among them, only Enoch had the power of ice, and only the descendants of the House of Daphne, who inherited their blood, could use fire. However, if the heroine's memory does not fail her, Liana was completely incapable of using the power of fire. She assumed that she probably could not have the ability to control the power of fire. And according to the novel's plot, Eliseo showed the most powerful fire ability in the Empire. It was because of this that Liana was portrayed as a villain, consumed by an inferiority complex. The emperor was surprised. This could not be, and to suppress her power, the girl's abilities had to be much beyond the ordinary. Liana smiled and replied that if anyone could have such power, it would definitely be her sister Eliseo. At that moment, the operator decided to take a desperate step and slowly began to remove the thick black glove from his hand. He touched the young lady's cheek with his fingertip to check if he had understood everything correctly. Liana pushed his hand away, declaring that the young man had really gone crazy and didn't understand what was happening. Willing to die frozen, he already had some guesses and only quietly asked the lady to look at his hand. The ice that spread over his hand began to slowly melt before the heroine's eyes. The girl was indignant. He couldn't just tell her, and decided to show her in such an unexpected way. Liana was incredibly frightened that in a matter of seconds, the emperor would turn into an ice statue. He gently hugged the lady and confessed that he had just discovered a cure for the terrible curse. It was an incredibly unusual day, and Liana put the little girl to bed late at night. Liana's heart filled with warm emotions when she saw the child sleeping sweetly, whom, as it turned out, he had brought from somewhere. Today the heroine received another interesting item hanging around her neck. It was a precious pendant with a huge blue stone, and she accepted it as a gift from the emperor. Liana would never have imagined that in her new life, she would become the cure to lift a terrible curse. And at that moment, she saw how incredibly happy the emperor was that he could finally get rid of the insidious illness. Everything happened so suddenly when the emperor confessed that she was the medicine. With special care and respect, the young man asked the girl to help melt the ice in his heart to get rid of the curse forever. Liana felt that she could not leave this man in trouble because she met him at the beginning of the novel. Although she said she wouldn't be his cure, the emperor gave her the pendant and asked her to think about it a little. Liana was already going through a difficult time with her situation and felt that this would cause her inconvenience. The young man looked so desperate that she definitely couldn't ignore it. She was willing to swear that the emperor from the book she read was an evil tyrant, but for some reason, this young man did not behave like a villain at all. In person, despite his cold appearance, he did not give the impression of being a tyrant. And perhaps the real story simply hasn't started yet. However, the gentleman showed his tyrannical nature only towards the middle of the story, when Liana had to disappear from it. Moreover, the heroine had no idea that the emperor had such a secret when someone touched him. His body would be covered in ice inside. In the book, the Lord was simply an irascible emperor, but the reason for it is never mentioned. The only thing said was that his mother, the former empress, died because her powers got out of control when he was a child. That's why the emperor never used his powers again, but for some reason, this strangely bothered Liana now. She sighed, thinking that the young man was incredibly handsome, which is why she couldn't resist him. She still felt as if the young man was sitting next to her, asking her to touch him. This icy young man, who until recently was the most terrible person in the empire, now for some reason turned out to be incredibly sweet to her. And she was ready to become his medicine, even though they met for the first time today. Now she really didn't imagine it, and the outlines of the gentleman really appeared in her room. She was scared because the young man looked like a real ghost and suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He said that the pendant she had given him had a communication spell, so he could appear at any time. The emperor also said that the pendant contained a teleportation spell, so that Liana could move to him. She needed to press the button on the back of the pendant. Liana held the magical thing in her hands and couldn't believe how much was in that small pendant. Her answer remained the same. She did not want to agree to become the emperor's medicine. Upon hearing these words, the young man got annoyed in a fraction of a second, admitting that he was very disappointed with her decision. When she entered his room the other day, she promised to do everything if he let her touch him one more time. Now it seemed to Enoch that the lady had achieved what she wanted and was behaving as if she had never met him. Liana was indignant at his words and asked His Majesty not to speak like that again, so that people would not misunderstand them. Anyway, a banquet was to be held tomorrow night, and the emperor invited the young lady to go with him. Liana turned her head back and forth, refusing, and did not understand why she had to go there. Enoch wanted the lady to go with him to try to charm her with that face that she seemed to like. And since the lady did not agree to be his medicine, he assumed that he would have to work harder to win her heart. He asked again if the little girl really wouldn't go with him to the formal event tomorrow. The emperor had not been in vain in persuading Liana to go the night before, because soon she agreed anyway, even though she definitely had no intention of going anywhere. With the help of a magic pendant, she immediately teleported to the palace, where a grand banquet was being held. The lady looked around and saw guests she didn't know, and intended to stand silently in a corner. She felt uncomfortable standing around doing nothing, and her throat was dry. So Liana picked up a glass and decided to just lightly moisten her lips. She passed by some girls who were heatedly discussing how irresistible the Duke still was. Liana listened captivated and didn't even realize how one of the girls spilled an alcoholic drink on her snow-white glove. Her carelessness was noticed by one of the ladies present, who said that if a girl was there, she should at least have made herself noticeable. She insisted that the lady was behaving indecently, and no one noticed that she was walking there. The ladies whispered and laughed at the lady. She was definitely not a noble lady and came today, even though no one expected her. Before her eyes, the aristocrats were shamelessly discussing whether Liana probably came to establish at least some kind of connection with the emperor. They didn't even care at all that Liana could perfectly hear their conversation, and how unfriendly they were acting. At that moment, Liana noticed with dismay a man in the crowd, a duke who knew exactly who she was. Duke Harrington was the father of Elisha, the novel's protagonist, who was her sister. Once his daughter awakened the power of fire, she expelled Liana's father, who was the heir, and took possession of the duchy. In this world, where a few ability holders had absolute power and were revered, their strength, backed by their fire ability, sometimes exerted even more influence than the emperor. Of course, Enoch of the imperial family also had the ability, but there were only rumors of its awakening, and no one had seen him use it. Besides, Eliseo was definitely the future empress. The duke's power had become even stronger, but this certainly didn't worry the heroine now. The girl who was rude to her admitted that she heard from her father that she would soon have to choose a bride for himself, and she asked if the lady knew who the emperor was interested in. But now Liana was only thinking about how to quickly get something to drink. Liana didn't even listen to what the rude woman was telling her and only looked at her glass. Her friend was indignant, declaring that this place belonged to Lady Elisha and that it was time for Liana to stop bothering her. The new heroine decided not to remain silent any longer and confidently asked if she had really been bothering her sister all this time. The girl insisted that Eliseo always took care of her, as they were relatives, and Liana asked if she had really seen that. Liana asked. She was very interested to know how much the strange person had really seen it with his own eyes. The girl could not prove the veracity of her words, and Liana only wanted to know how threatening she was in this matter. Raising the glass to her tender lips, the heroine took a sip and assumed that everything remains unchanged, both in the story and outside of it. The heroine felt someone's gaze upon her, and, looking among the crowd of guests, she saw a young man staring intently at her. The expression on his face was quite strange, and there were empty glasses on the table behind the lady. Indeed, she didn't even realize how quickly she managed to drink all the wine that was on the table. She immediately left the room so as not to feel embarrassed and get away from those stupid empty glasses. The heroine didn't understand how, with so many people in the room, this man could notice her so quickly. But the strangest thing of all was that she always found herself with a glass in her hand when she came to her senses. And even without Liana's memories, her old habits were still infused in this body. Liana decided to get some fresh air, but when she approached the window, she heard men's voices. There was definitely someone there. The voice was definitely like the Duke's, and they seemed to be talking about the Emperor. After listening carefully, Liana soon became convinced that the honorable gentlemen were really saying something about His Majesty. Conflicts were discussed, and the Duke asked to keep the Emperor, but for now he could not change his plans. The man next to him was surprised that the Duke actually claimed that all they had to do was contact this man, and soon everything would be clear. Liana clearly heard that other people knew about the Emperor's vulnerability, and this might be related to the death of the late Empress. The Duke insisted that the child knew that his touch had killed his mother and might have provoked something in him, and in any case, he was to blame for the Empress's death. But at that moment, the Duke suddenly fell silent and turned around. He looked coldly towards the window, and his interlocutor wondered if someone was watching them. The Duke looked carefully around the building, making sure they were completely alone on the balcony, and they didn't need to worry. He asked to make sure that the Emperor was busy at the appointed time to carry out his plan, and also asked, if possible, to find out what weakness the Emperor was hiding so carefully from the public. Liana heard the whole conversation perfectly, standing near the window, and the lady was very scared, realizing that she definitely needed to run away as fast as possible. For some reason, her body turned to stone like a mountain, and she couldn't move her arm or leg. She only had a couple of seconds to go unnoticed, but her body treacherously turned to stone, and the Duke managed to notice the girl and grab her by the neck. The man shouted. He ordered her to sit quietly in the locked house, but for some reason, the girl did not obey him. Liana screamed, struggling to breathe, as the Duke held her tightly by the neck and continued to scold her. He threw the young lady aside and asked if she had drunk again and if he could smell the disgusting smell of alcohol. His behavior was simply terrible. His words were rude, and the Duke asked her why she couldn't take proper care of the child. Liana didn't understand what was going on there, and why he dared to treat her like that and especially talk about the child. The Duke held his head and asked if the young lady had really drunk so much that she didn't even remember what had happened recently. He became increasingly angry as he realized that the lady was pretending not to understand who he was talking about. The next second, he confidently stated that he was talking about Elisha's son, and that he had ordered her to protect him. And at that moment, I finally found out who the baby belonged to, and indeed it belonged to Elisha. The novel does not say that Elisha had a son, and it was definitely a baby named Ariel. The Duke warned Liana that if she made sure Elisha did not find out about that child, when the time came, he would come to take her away. The man was a cruel man, and he even promised Ariel that if someone stopped being useful, he would throw the child out of the palace without a second thought. This concerned not only her, but also her sister, and the Duke didn't care about either of them at all. For the first time in the novel, the heroine encountered such a cruel person, and she couldn't even believe that he was actually her relative. And he simply grabbed her by the neck with his own hands and also cursed her and threatened. But now it was much more important to get the necessary information, and she listened to everything she needed. Judging by the conversation she overheard, the Duke was definitely plotting something. After that, she definitely couldn't allow the Emperor to get involved with this treacherous man. And if the Duke manages to find out about the Emperor's curse, he will take advantage of his weak point. Liana entered the hall again and immediately caught the Emperor's attention. And his assistant, the young man, was very surprised to see the strange expression on the lady's face. As if something had happened to her, everything was almost perfect, and at least the girl managed to draw the knight's attention to herself. It happened that she shouted his name loudly throughout the hall, which already attracted the attention of many nobles. An aristocrat noticed that the lady was again trying to do something with His Majesty, demanding his closest attention. In fact, Liana was trying to prevent the emperor from losing control at the banquet. But now, she felt very uncomfortable under all the gazes. The matter was very important, and Liana approached the emperor and asked if she could hold his hand for a moment. This proposal was too strange, because just a little while ago she herself had refused. Certainly, Enoch did not expect the young lady to approach him in the middle of the banquet and offer to touch him. Before the emperor could understand anything, Liana had already skillfully removed the glove from his hand and asked him to wait. And now, right in front of all the aristocrats, Liana was carefully holding the emperor's hand. The guests noticed this and assumed that the girl was acting as if she had gone completely crazy. But His Majesty really takes her hand, even though everyone knew he shouldn't be touched. Holding his hand, Liana said that she overheard a conversation between the Duke and a man on the balcony, and that it was very urgent. The emperor sighed. His life had been too calm lately, and this was probably the calm before the storm. Liana suggested that they hold hands one way or another, so that the emperor would not lose control of his curse. The brave lady even offered to hug him tighter and hide behind his back if necessary. The young man asked what would happen if someone else tried to harm the girl, and she couldn't resist. And he couldn't even believe that this fragile lady was offering him, a tall young man, to hide behind his back. The lady warned that now is not the time to hesitate, and that a decision must be made as soon as possible. She even promised to make sure that no one dared to touch the knight and to watch him closely. The heroine offered to urgently go to the Duke, and was even willing to accompany the emperor so that nothing would happen to him. For the first time, Enoch felt that someone cared about him and that this care came from the heart. He asked if the lady could really protect him, because it seemed too absurd. Liana warned that the emperor must under no circumstances interfere in the conflicts, because he would not be able to contain his curse. They approached Duke Harrington, who bowed to the emperor and admitted that it was an honor for him to be present at the banquet. But his next question was unexpected. He wanted to know why the emperor was next to the Viscountess. Liana couldn't even breathe and felt intense fear upon seeing this man. Enoch seemed to perceive this and offered to speak privately with the Duke and invited the young lady to enjoy the banquet. He whispered that he would definitely return soon, and Liana could continue protecting him. Seeing his strange whisper, the Duke frowned and wondered what was going on between those two. The heroine decided to spend her free time outdoors, next to a huge and majestic fountain. She was annoyed because she had promised to protect the emperor, but she herself trembled in front of the Duke, and he certainly noticed it. And above all, Liana couldn't understand why her body wouldn't obey her in the Duke's presence. The lady really wanted the emperor to have no conflict with the Duke, and they would just discuss everything calmly. As soon as she thought about it, Enoch appeared before her eyes against the night sky. The heroine had no intention of saying that she was overwhelmed by attention after the situation was resolved. The emperor said that the Duke would take part in a conflict with another state, and he told her this himself. He understood that Liana was afraid that the young man might lose control of the curse, and he did not expect her to help him so much. In fact, for some reason, Liana didn't care about the emperor's fate or curse. After all these events, she changed her mind and agreed to become the cure to remove the curse. After her words, Enoch was surprised, and even thought that the young lady had probably drunk too much alcohol. Liana only took a sip, and admitted that she was definitely not drunk and understood everything. After this sip, another glass of wine followed, and the young lady also told him. The emperor asked if Liana had forgotten what the doctor had recently told her about alcohol. The young lady insisted that she had only drunk a little, and the emperor invited her to get into the carriage, promising to join her soon. As soon as Liana rested her hand on the bench, she suddenly wanted to lie down, and the emperor saw her in an extremely strange state. Enoch offered to send his knight to escort the lady to the carriage, which was already comfortably seated on a bench. The heroine clearly felt under her feet that, for some reason, the path was constantly winding, and her legs completely refused to obey. But until that moment, she was sure that everything was quite strange, and that she had only drunk a little alcohol. And as soon as she tried to take a step, she immediately fell flat on her face on the ground, near the fountain. Now she definitely looked like a real alcoholic, not to mention the fact that the lady was dying of shame at that moment. After the fall, she hit her knee hard, blood appeared on her leg, and it was completely unpleasant to appear before the emperor in that state. Sitting near the bush, she continued to blame the treacherous glasses of alcohol for everything, because if it weren't for them, none of this would have happened. While Liana was still angry, she suddenly heard a voice next to her, and it sounded very familiar. It was the Duke scolding his assistant for not being able to manage even unanimity properly. The assistant was terribly sorry and stated that the insolent Viscountess had intervened at the most critical moment. The Duke warned that they must speed up the marriage alliance between His Majesty and Eliseo, and this was part of his plan. The assistant promised that even in the Duke's presence, they would ensure that everything would turn out well. The heroine was stunned. For some reason, she heard the unpleasant conversation again, upon learning how cruel the main character's father was. She should have kept her distance from the man until they clashed again. But right behind the bushes, the Duke was standing nearby again. Liana tried to behave calmly, but the alcohol took over her physical state, and the lady quietly touched the bushes. The Duke saw her and immediately shouted, asking if the girl had picked up the habit of loitering, calling her a dirty rat. Liana assured that she had not eavesdropped under any circumstances, and only prayed that the night would arrive soon. Looking at him, she tried to smile and said that she just felt dizzy and fell next to the bushes. The angry man didn't want to hear anything else. He waved his hand and slapped the girl hard on the cheek. A crimson mark appeared on Liana's cheek, contrasting with the paleness of her mottled skin. The lady flinched, staggering from such sudden rudeness. Her face twisted into a grimace of uncontrollable anger. Her eyes flashed lightning. The assistant could not defend the lady, given her low status, and the Duke did not want the lady to betray the emperor again. Liana remained silent with her gaze lowered, feeling hurt, offended, and scared. She knew that any word she said now would only add fuel to the fire. The Duke feared that she might stain his reputation, and he threatened her to keep quiet and not create trouble again. Forgetting about the property and the assistant nearby, the Duke poured his anger out on the unfortunate young lady, and he was sure that she had definitely already attracted the emperor's attention and had some kind of connection with him. The Duke crouched in front of Liana and asked her menacingly if she really thought getting close to the emperor would change anything. He certainly wasn't going to give her an inch of freedom, but Liana listened carefully to those words, and she didn't understand what they were talking about. In the original story, Liana approached the emperor not because of her status as empress, but for a completely different reason. As she wanted to live, the heroine even suggested that maybe Liana had some kind of illness. But she seemed quite healthy, and she is still conscious even after the hard blow the Duke just dealt her. All this time, the young lady remained silent, and the Duke began to get even angrier because she ignored and did not respond to his words. Liana closed her eyes and felt fear that this man might very well hit her again despite his wishes. As soon as he put his hand over her head, a cold male voice was heard behind him. The emperor saw the Duke attacking Liana and disregarding court etiquette. He quickly approached him. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were filled with manifest displeasure, and the Duke held his breath, anticipating the anger. The emperor calmly asked the Duke what he had allowed himself to do there, and he had to answer his question. The Duke grabbed Liana by the hand and began to lie, as if it were the young lady who had caused the commotion at the banquet, and he, supposedly being the head of the family, only scolded her a little. But the emperor knew that this did not make the Duke of House Harrington the head of House Daphne. The emperor threatened the Duke, assuring him that there was something in that fragile body that he should not touch. He began to justify himself by saying that he was simply scolding the girl, and that these injuries were sustained when she fell on her own. He was not to blame if bruises appeared on her body, even though the slap mark was visible on the girl's face. Standing in front of the emperor, the Duke continued to lie shamelessly and probably thought that after hitting the girl, she would let him go that easily. The young lady had already firmly decided that the Duke would be punished with the utmost severity for daring to hit her. Enoch immediately noticed the lady's bleeding lips. She confessed that the Duke had indeed hit her. He continued to insist that Liana was shamelessly deceiving His Majesty, trying to go unpunished in this situation. Liana replied confidently it was the Duke who hit her in the face, so hard that almost all her teeth fell out. The emperor warned that the Duke constantly talked about his deep affection for his niece, but his way of showing affection seemed rather crude. The Duke tried to explain something, but the emperor knew that he was hiding behind his niece's patronage, and he gained control not only over the fortune of the Daphne family, but over the entire house. In the novel, the Duke is described as an arrogant character. He controlled everything and tried to lay his hands on the girl's fortune. But here, in A New Life, just one look from the Duke paralyzed the young lady to the point of fear and trembling throughout her body. And on top of everything, this villain took away all the fortune from the innocent girl, seizing her riches. It's not that Liana had read the novel very carefully, but neither the Emperor nor the real heroine were as she remembered. The Emperor stated that if this is what the Duke calls protection, perhaps his powers should be revoked as soon as possible. Upon hearing this, the man became terribly scared, assuring that for all those years he had been protecting the Daphne house for about 20 years. And now, he couldn't believe how the Emperor could suddenly strip him of his title, when he had only taught this girl a lesson. Even if it was a matter of discipline, the Emperor realized, and the Duke became incredibly angry. He declared that the Duke's guardianship over House Daphne would only continue until the heiress reached adulthood. The Emperor warned the Duke that he should have returned everything a long time ago, but he had deliberately postponed it for years. Enoch approached the villain and whispered in his ear that he kept looking for his niece's fortune. The Duke tried to prove that his fortune was much greater and that he was just continuing to manage the house, because Liana supposedly asked him to. The Emperor turned to the young lady to hear her true opinion and asked if it was true. The heroine didn't know what the real Liana was like, but now she was a completely different person, and she definitely didn't believe it. It was impossible to disobey the Emperor's word, and His Majesty declared that from that day on, all the power of House Daphne should be returned to its rightful heir. The Duke never expected the Emperor to defend his niece and decided to properly address the violence. His Majesty asked the lady if she would like to choose a special punishment for the Duke. The Duke had mentioned before that there was still time before his departure, but Liana needed him to disappear somewhere now. Therefore, she was going to ask the Emperor to send the Duke and his assistant somewhere far away. The young lady smiled and asked to send them to the battlefield right away so they would disappear without a trace. The Emperor hurried to heal Liana's broken knee, and the girl's bruise hurt a lot. The young man tried to do everything carefully and asked if she really thought such a punishment was appropriate for the Duke. She just wanted the Duke to go to the battlefield right now, and the Emperor still had no intention of following procedure. He warned that if the Duke died, problems would arise, but the lady shouldn't worry about that now. When he said these words, the Emperor's face remained impassive. The young man admitted that he hadn't actually intended to eavesdrop or meddle in Liana's affairs, but he had been there at the perfect moment. The Emperor spoke about the Duke's words and said that if the girl came closer to him, she could finally breathe freely. The heroine understood that this question had been bothering the Emperor all this time, and he just wanted her to be happy. To be honest, she herself admitted that she didn't know what to do next, and the whole time, the Duke had treated her rudely. Every time she saw the Duke, her body froze, she couldn't even speak normally, and it seemed that the heroine had a terrible relationship with him. Liana admitted that, as the Emperor knew, there were many gaps in her memory, so she couldn't even give a clear answer to his question. But she asked not to be misunderstood, and her memory loss had nothing to do with alcohol. It was obvious that the young man was clearly worried about her and just wanted her to stay by his side. Liana asked if she could really buy medicine for the Emperor in return, and after that, her life would definitely change. Even the Emperor didn't know how the treatment would go. He could only assume that Liana's fiery power was capable of melting the splinter in his heart. In this situation, the young man feared that his mind and heart would eventually become completely numb. But even while saying these words, he still smiled and believed that he could start living a normal life. And happy, the heroine still couldn't understand why he had chosen her, and if he needed fire power. Eliseo was the most suitable person. The Emperor confessed that he had previously tried to establish contact with the lady, but that this still led to murder. Therefore, he was sure that only Liana could break the terrible centuries-old curse. And she was the only girl whose hand he could hold, the only one from whom he felt warmth. For many years, the Emperor tried to break the curse, but now he was completely sure that he only needed Liana. After hearing his story, the heroine finally agreed to help the Emperor, because she was the key to the solution. She didn't know if she could be of any use, but she decided to try to be his medicine. Upon hearing the consent, Enoch became incredibly happy and thanked the lady, although she still couldn't believe in his powers. The young man warned that the girl could freely turn to his help whenever she needed it, but Liana had no intention of using the Emperor, and did it without expecting anything in return. The heroine didn't even know why she agreed. But even after the rejection, she kept thinking about it, and her true feelings burst out. If anything, with the emperor's help, she found out whose son Ariel was and now felt some peace. She told the emperor that the baby was Elisio's son, but he didn't seem to know it either. The emperor managed to grasp her thought, stroked the lady's head, and asked her to rest well, and he promised to talk about the rest tomorrow. Liana still had a lot to tell, but she felt she was too tired and just wanted to sleep. The thought of the girl's role as medicine haunted her, and she needed to express her gratitude for saving her. But while Liana was thinking about all this, she didn't even notice how she closed her eyes and fell asleep instantly. She fell asleep sitting in the chair, and the emperor stood beside her and wondered if this was really happening to him. Although Liana was the only one who could melt the ice in his heart, he himself didn't understand why he did it. The emperor was furious with the duke, whom he normally ignored, but nevertheless. Now he just had to put the lady to bed. He carefully lifted her to lay her on the bed and felt how light and fragile Liana was, and certainly couldn't understand how it was possible to hit such an innocent creature. And fragile, the young man laid the girl on the bed on a soft pillow and noticed that the capillaries on her cheek had even broken from the hard blow. Enoch knew he needed to apply ice to her cheek before her face swelled up even more. The emperor was worried. He needed to leave silently before the lady woke up, so as not to disturb her peace. But at that moment, he saw a small child, Ariel, walking on the floor, who should be in his crib at that moment. The child stood up and blinked, looking at the emperor and muttering something in baby language. The emperor was sure that just a couple of days ago Ariel could barely speak in front of him, but now he was trying to make some incomprehensible sounds. The young man laughed, realizing that the child was simply inviting him to play. But he already had to leave. He carefully placed the child next to Liana, then lay down beside her himself. And this scene was incredibly strange. Enoch had decided to stay because of Ariel, to make sure the child had fallen asleep. But now he himself couldn't fall asleep. Liana was fast asleep, and suddenly, the young man felt the girl turn over in her sleep and gently hug him around the waist. He heard his heart beat fast and felt that he had never been so confused. For some reason, the damned heart, which usually never cared, suddenly started beating wildly. And it was really the ice that melted because he touched Liana. The young man's heart was beating so loudly that he couldn't even believe what would happen when it completely thawed. Perhaps the emperor's heart should melt enough to avoid making unnecessary noise. Lying in the same bed with Liana and the baby, the young man moved in the bed and felt that he couldn't fall asleep. From then on, the emperor never shared his bed with anyone and lived for many years, and slept in complete solitude. Looking at the sleeping girl, he saw that the swelling on her cheek had worsened in an instant, and Liana's face had started to swell a lot. He was afraid to move so as not to wake Liana, and the servant bell was out of reach. It was necessary to cool the bruise before the swelling increased, and the emperor simply decided to use the ice curse for good. When he was 7, the emperor's power killed his mother, and since then he has been too afraid to use ice magic again. And now, after so many years, Enoch decided to use a terrible curse to remove the swelling from that sweet face. Maybe the elders would be furious if they found out about this. The emperor took off his glove and brought his hand to the bruise, fearing that the girl would become as cold as his mother. He carefully controlled his powers, and Liana, while sleeping, gently took his hand and mumbled something indistinctly. While sleeping, the girl smiled, feeling a pleasant coolness touch the painful bruise. For the first time in his life, the emperor's curse had benefited someone, and curiously, he could control it when he was near this girl. For some reason, he smiled while looking at the sleeping Liana, and the smile brightened his face. Holding his hand over her cheek, the emperor suddenly felt her smile sweetly in response. And if anyone saw him now, they would definitely decide that the cold-blooded emperor had gone mad. Little Ariel slept soundly in the bed, and soon the emperor also fell fast asleep. She suddenly woke up abruptly and felt refreshed, but she knew it was too much for just a 5-minute nap. She opened her eyes and realized that the room was still dark, and it shouldn't be morning yet. Liana decided to sleep a little longer, and when she buried her face in the pillow, she felt it was too hard for some reason. But as soon as she opened her eyes further, she realized that she hadn't buried her face in the pillow, but in the emperor's shoulder. Enoch also woke up and asked the girl if she had slept well while he watched her sleep. Smiling, he asked the lady to get off his hand because it was numb, and Liana couldn't understand why the emperor was lying in her bed again. She jumped away from the young man abruptly and asked him what he was doing there. And she definitely didn't remember how she fell asleep yesterday. Enoch assumed that the lady was probably making something up again, but he hurried to warn that this was not the case at all. What he feared most was not remembering anything again, and that perhaps the same situation had occurred. Liana feared that it was due to the alcoholic drinks that she attacked the emperor again. Remembering the previous incident, the emperor said that this time the girl did nothing and just slept peacefully and didn't even touch him. Liana grabbed a mirror to examine her bruise, but was surprised that her face was completely normal. Just last night, her cheek was incredibly swollen, but now she couldn't see any trace of the severe bruise. She continued to look in the mirror surprised, not understanding how this could have happened. The emperor touched her face and asked if she felt any pain, but the bruise had disappeared without a trace. Enoch was incredibly happy to be able to help her in some way, using a terrible curse that always brought death and disappointment. The heroine sincerely thanked him and admitted that if it weren't for him, the situation would have resulted in disaster. However, the emperor warned that her lips and broken capillaries required proper treatment. Liana saw that for some reason, this young man showed her affection and support, even though they had only known each other for a short time. At that moment, a child's voice was heard, and Liana was surprised that Ariel had actually spent the night in the same bed with them. She was sure that the butler had put the baby to bed in his room, but for some reason, the baby only came to her bed at night. Ariel was in a very good mood and was already saying a few words, something like mommy, daddy, and love. The heroine was incredibly happy that the child liked being there, but perhaps soon she would have to forbid him from calling her mommy, because she perfectly understood that this was not her child, but her sister, Elicio's son. The emperor looked at the young lady with surprise, and Liana noticed his cautious gaze. The young man asked the heroine if she thought the baby had grown a lot, as if he were growing by leaps and bounds. However, the interesting thing was that Ariel could already pronounce a few words, and for some reason, he still called Liana mommy. Perhaps the name Liana was too difficult for the child, and that is why he called the closest person mommy. Liana decided to make sure of this, and asked Ariel to try to repeat a few words after her. She said his name syllable by syllable, while the baby tried to pronounce it, but he couldn't do it at all. The emperor suspected that something was clearly not right there, but Liana couldn't suspect someone so sweet at all. But one thing was clear, this child now needed protection and care, because his mother was not near him. Ariel looked away from the emperor and started muttering something angrily, looking at the nightstand. The heroes heard a strange noise, as if something was vibrating somewhere, and it was definitely the emperor's pendant. The young man picked up the familiar jewel and realized that someone was calling him for an urgent matter. One of the emperor's aides called him via magical communication and wanted to know where His Highness had been last night. He realized that the young man was in the Viscountess's room and was surprised that he had actually spent the night with her. The emperor stated that it no longer mattered and asked why there was such urgency. Ignoring his assistant, Enoch asked if Liana was hungry and hadn't even managed to have a proper dinner yesterday. The assistant asked the emperor if it was true that he himself had raised his hand against Duke Harrington yesterday. His Majesty had most likely dismissed the Duke, but he had never been interested in his affairs before. Therefore, the assistant was surprised that the emperor suddenly turned his attention to the Duke's misdeeds. He asked His Majesty to return to the palace immediately and bring the young lady with him to resolve some matters. Luckily, the heroes had to stay a little longer, and the emperor urgently needed to change his clothes, because little Ariel spilled milk on His Majesty just before leaving. Liana was worried about causing too much inconvenience, but he assured her that it had nothing to do with her, and that she was not causing any particular trouble. And it is true that the child did not spill the milk on purpose. She was just being a little girl. While the emperor was changing, Ariel sat next to Liana, and suddenly a frowning expression appeared on his face. The baby started crawling around Liana, while the lady tried to calm him down, assuring him that it could be dangerous. Ariel started behaving strangely. He crawled with all his might, and the emperor didn't understand what was happening. Maybe the child was bored and was trying to cheer himself up that way, and the heroine, with a happy smile, asked the child to calm down a bit. What worried her most was that someone would step on Ariel's hand, but the danger was elsewhere. Liana accidentally pushed the changing screen, which immediately flew towards the emperor. Liana couldn't stay on her feet, and the next second she was supposed to collapse along with this screen. In any case, the screen fell and the lady, along with it, fell right on top of the emperor, who was changing his clothes at that moment. The young man hadn't even had time to button his shirt, and Liana was right on top of him, touching his bare torso with her hands. Every time, for some reason, the heroine caused inconvenience to the young man, and she worried if everything was all right with him. She was afraid of inadvertently harming the emperor, and this, after promising to be his medicine. The lady tried to get up as quickly as possible for fear that she would now definitely be executed or exiled from the city. Still, Liana had already noticed that the emperor really had a beautiful body. Of course, he was a character from an adult novel. At that moment, the girl felt that she had gone completely crazy and stupid thoughts began to visit her. Liana hurried to button his shirt and declared that this was a complete disgrace because the young man was lying there with his shirt unbuttoned. Liana began to justify herself, warning that she could not undress like that in front of everyone and let herself be touched, and that this was definitely not acceptable. In fact, the heroine was simply so embarrassed that she was ready to sink into the floor. The emperor laughed, noticing that, for some reason, the girl couldn't stop looking at his bare chest. The heroine's cheeks turned as red as ripe cherries that she couldn't even breathe from the stress. Her hand was still touching the emperor's body, and at that moment, he noticed something strange. Her fingers gently touched his body. The heroine suddenly asked if the emperor could open his shirt a little more. The young man didn't understand anything, because a moment ago she had ordered him to button up. But now Liana insisted that she needed to take a good look at something. The symbol over his heart seemed to fade every time the girl touched it. Liana asked the emperor to take a look when she touched the symbols. They lit up, but disappeared as soon as she withdrew her hand. She tried to understand how the young man's body reacted to her touch, but she had kept her hand on his chest for too long. It seemed that when she touched him, the power of the curse weakened, and that's why the symbol paled. It was simply incredible, and Liana, excited, asked if she could touch him again. In fact, she just wanted to help him and look at the disappearing ice symbol once more to make sure she could really do something. For some reason, Enoch was in no hurry to get up and only modestly covered his bare body with a shirt. Liana started to worry that she might have hit the young man and asked if she really should help him get up. The embarrassed emperor was still sitting on the floor and for some reason did not get up. But he definitely felt no pain. The heroine became even more frightened, thinking that perhaps he had assumed she was harassing him. And at the most inopportune moment, the room doors burst open, and the butler entered with a blonde lady who asked him to release her hand. The heroes saw a strange situation. The emperor was sitting in the room with his shirt unbuttoned, and next to him was Lady Liana. It was her sister Eliseo, who certainly did not expect to see her sister sitting with the emperor. Eliseo indignantly asked what they had done there, while none of the heroes could explain what was happening. Now Liana will surely have to tell her sister something so that she doesn't invent all sorts of things. All the heroes gathered at the table, drinking delicious aromatic tea, but so far none of them had said a word. Little Ariel was next to Liana the whole time, and she realized that it was worth starting with an explanation about Ariel. The Duke insisted that she not tell her sister anything about this, but it would be right to inform her that her son was there. It is also strange that Ariel calls her mommy, right in front of his real mother. For some reason, her sister suddenly burst into tears, asking if Liana had really achieved her goal. The heroine didn't understand what was going on, nor why her sister had started the conversation with that. But she had always said before that she wanted to be with the emperor. It turns out Liana kept repeating this over and over, and now her sister found her in the room with His Highness. She tried to explain that Eliseo had misunderstood everything, and that she and His Majesty had simply fallen by accident. But for some reason her sister didn't want to listen to her. She was nervous and shouting, stating that she knew everything without any explanation. Eliseo certainly couldn't know anything, but she suddenly declared that she had heard everything with her own ears. Her father had been stripped of all authority over Daphne's property, and her sister was already well aware of this information. Technically, nothing was taken from the Duke, but what was already rightfully Liana's property was returned to her. Eliseo was angry because her sister had sent her old father to the battlefield without even a sword, knowing that he would not survive. Upon hearing her words, she was incredibly surprised because she called the Duke old, the same one she knew. She argued that her father was not entirely weak and that he was still full of strength, and that he had simply lost all his titles. Liana realized that her sister was not going to listen to her, and was proving the opposite, trying to persuade her to do something. It seems that today the girl constantly finds herself in a bad position, although she has done absolutely nothing of the sort. Gritting her teeth, Eliseo stated threateningly that it was Liana's fault that her father was sent to the battlefield. The girl was still indignant, as if Liana was so upset that her father had become duke instead of her father. During all this time, Liana didn't even think about it once, while her sister was sure that she was doing all this on purpose. The sister's hands were trembling. She was very angry because Liana had done all this out of revenge, and she had even recently been in His Majesty's rooms. Eliseo stated that her sister had deliberately gotten close to the emperor, and that she didn't even care that the emperor was sitting next to her. Liana decided to clarify, and asked if her sister really thought she had planned all this long ago. Enoch decided to intervene in the conversation, and suggested that if his sister wouldn't listen to Liana, at least she would listen to him. He asked if he was like a puppet emperor, who let himself be controlled by a little revenge. Eliseo realized that she had spoken too harshly, and admitted that she hadn't meant that at all. The emperor severely stated that the girl had inherited from her father the ability to invent all sorts of nonsense, and he had absolutely no desire to grasp the essence of the matter. He managed at least to somewhat stop Eliseo's harsh statements, accusing her sister of things she hadn't done. The young man noticed that the girl felt unwell and asked if she was really that bad. He even offered to bring her warm water with honey, and probably after the alcohol from the day before. She felt sick. Liana appreciated the emperor's concern, but understood that she now had to pay attention to her sister to resolve something important. Suddenly, Eliseo stood up and declared that she was the emperor's fiancée, but he didn't remember ever having a fiancé. The lady told the prophecy, assuring that she and the emperor were destined for each other since birth. She spoke again about this absurd story, and many believed that the Daphne family would become the emperor's salvation. The young man smiled and asked if the Daphne family was definitely not limited to Eliseo, and that she had a sister. Perhaps the prophecy was not complete nonsense. After all, and Lady Elisha certainly wouldn't be his salvation. After his words, the girl began to get even angrier, because all this time she was sure that one day she would become empress. She called her sister stupid, insisting that she didn't even have skills, and her father and even the late emperor said the opposite, that it was Eliseo who was destined for the emperor, and that she alone should become his only wife. Enoch asked the girl if she thought her father simply wanted a puppet emperor whom she could control. Despite everything, Eliseo still believed that the emperor was obliged to marry only her. The lady burst into tears and didn't want anyone to see her tears, so she prepared to leave and headed for the door. The emperor asked her before leaving if Eliseo really wanted to marry him, although he had no idea about it. Opening the door carefully, the lady admitted with tears in her eyes that she had certainly believed in such an outcome all her life. It was the first time such a frank dialogue had taken place between the sisters, and Liana had no idea what Elisha really felt for her. She felt that she absolutely had to go find her sister to talk to her privately about what had happened. Liana went out onto the balcony and asked if Eliseo wanted to talk to her so that no doubts remained in her mind. She asked respectfully, but her sister angrily declared what right Liana had to talk to her. The heroine understood that her sister didn't like her, but now insisted that her father had started all this, and that she should look at her bruise. There were small scratches on the girl's cheek, and she told Eliseo that her father, the Duke, had done this yesterday. Eliseo couldn't believe that her sister claimed that her father had hit her and behaved inappropriately. But her sister didn't have an ounce of sympathy and only replied that since that happened, Liana deserved it. The lady did not come there to argue. She simply wanted to have a frank conversation with her sister, and there will be no other suitable time to finally find out if Eliseo really has a small child. The sister asked Liana to watch her language and thought she was trying to cast doubt on her name with unfounded rumors. The heroine confidently declared that Ariel, the little girl by her side today, was Eliseo's daughter. After her words, the girl turned abruptly, and Liana once again explained that the small baby was her daughter. For some reason, Eliseo didn't even want to hear anything about it, and threateningly asked what business she had with the child. She didn't care at all if she was alive or dead, and admitted she didn't want to talk about it. For some reason, the girl was acting strangely, crying and being very nervous, assuring that she had absolutely nothing to do with it. Liana grabbed her sister's hand and asked how she could say such a thing when it concerned a small child. Eliseo shouted, the baby didn't exist for her at all, and it seemed this conversation was causing her too much pain. She believed she had no daughter, and asked her sister never to mention her again. Liana noticed that a minute ago Eliseo could barely stand, but suddenly she had incredible strength. The girl held a magic ring with a bright red ruby in her hand, but Liana had no idea what was going on. She felt like something was being torn out of her from the inside, and her sister was indignant because the lady had started making a scene. Although she had always kept silent before, she firmly held Liana's hand and asked her not to do anything else without her knowledge. The ring continued to glow with a bright light, while the sister insisted that no matter what Liana did, nothing would change in this life. The heroine managed to notice that the brighter her sister's ring shone, the weaker her body became. She felt her strength fading, and at some point Liana could no longer stand, involuntarily closing her eyes. The girl was about to faint because her body was so weak that she was completely unable to stand. And by a happy coincidence, the emperor was there again, holding her by the waist. And her sister decided to simply leave silently. She only asked Liana not to forget her words and never to speak to her on that topic again. Eliseo did not respond to Liana's requests to stop and continue the conversation. The emperor held the girl by the waist because she could barely stand. But at that moment, the heroine was worried that this is how everything happened. It turned out that Enoch heard a loud noise and immediately ran to the balcony, worried that something might have happened between the sisters. Liana was grateful that he had arrived in time. She only felt that she should have only told him about Ariel. She even laughed when she realized that the young man was very scared and saw his legs give way. And she apologized to him for worrying him with her family fights, assuring him that she was really fine. The emperor noticed something strange and asked what the lady had managed to do to her in such a short time. He clearly felt that the girl's body was completely cold, as if all the life force had left it. After arguing with Liana, Eliseo became so angry that she went to her room and started throwing things in different directions. She was irritated. Her sister had suddenly changed, the emperor too, and she couldn't understand what was happening. She tried to take the magic ring off her finger, but for some reason it wouldn't move. And as soon as she tried to do this, a knight in armor entered her room who definitely shouldn't have been there. Eliseo angrily shouted at the knight to leave her room immediately, and that he definitely couldn't have entered there without her permission. The young man in armor remained silent for some reason and only involuntarily smiled as he confidently entered the room. This irritated the girl even more, and it seemed to her that this man was deliberately ignoring her. She managed to take off the magic ring, but as soon as Lydia changed it, she became even angrier. Eliseo pushed the knight and once again asked him to leave her chambers immediately. But at that moment, the ring ended up in the hands of the knight, and he said that he now held something of great value in his hands. The knight warned her not to throw away the precious ring so hastily, and handed it into the lady's hands. This ring was made with all the heart by a kind person, and the girl should handle it more carefully. Eliseo was scared. No one should know about this ring except her father, her, and the person who created it. Right in front of her was a stranger who also knew about the ring, but Eliseo didn't recognize this man at all. The knight suddenly realized that the girl would hardly recognize him in that form, and at that moment, he was enveloped in magical power. The armor disappeared from the young man's body, and he appeared before the lady as a young man with bright scarlet eyes. He showed his true form. Eliseo recognized him immediately. And just think, the Duke was trapped on the battlefield at such a crucial moment. The young man touched the ring and warned that the forces must be replenished periodically, and only in this way will the magic ring work. He admitted that in any case they would meet the lady, and he hoped that next time she would give them a warmer welcome. The young man's magical appearance disappeared, and for a long time he awaited his epic return. Eliseo was left alone again in the room, and certainly did not expect to find him at that moment. Before disappearing, the young man invited the girl to go with him. She perfectly understood that she needed to do this. She touched the magic ring and said through clenched teeth, "You have to leave." During all this time, the emperor remained on the balcony with Liana, and the girl took a long time to come to her senses. Her body was still cold for some reason, and the emperor could not even warm her. It was strange, and he felt heat from her. The emperor was incredibly kind, but for some reason he continued to hug Liana, carefully and with reverence. On the one hand, the girl was happy with so much attention, but she asked him to at least loosen his grip a little. She touched his hand and asked if he still didn't feel the heat that she had radiated from him before. Everything was too strange, and after her sister's magical influence, something began to happen to Liana's body. She really didn't notice anything, but since Alicio grabbed her wrist, for some reason the Emperor felt no strength. He touched Liana's hand again, not understanding why her body had stopped emitting burning energy. The Emperor felt that his heart was no longer warmed, and the touch produced no reaction. It was as if only a weak particle of power remained, but it was so insignificant that the Emperor could barely notice it. Liana couldn't believe it, and tried to understand what had happened in those few seconds of conversation with her sister. When Alicio grabbed her, the heroine felt like something was escaping from her, and maybe that could be the reason. The Emperor had never heard of anything like this. Her sister certainly hadn't drunk the girl's blood, and it sounded simply impossible. But still, that option is also suddenly possible, with the slightest probability. The heroine's ability really disappeared in an instant. And now, Liana was very afraid that in that case, the Emperor might lose control just by touching her. And she immediately asked him to release her hand to find out as soon as possible why the energy was leaving her body. Liana began to worry that if her power had really disappeared, then the Emperor should not touch her under any circumstances. Enoch did not want the girl to let go of his hands and felt a faint pulsating magic within her. The magic was indeed very weak, but it still boiled inside Liana, and the young man felt a slight warmth. They stood there, embracing on the balcony, and Liana, trembling, pressed against Enoch's chest. She noticed that for some reason the Emperor seemed very worried, burying his face in her fragile shoulder. But if the heroine's power really disappears, she will no longer be able to stop the uproar of dark magic. And the Emperor was probably afraid of this. It was still dangerous for them to be close now. But the Emperor did not let go of the girl until the magic pendant vibrated in his pocket. Liana was about to answer the call, but hugging the Emperor, she could not reach the magic pendant. Finally, she felt the cherished chain on her back and pressed the button to answer the call. A voice came from the pendant, immediately greeting His Majesty Lady Liana. The call seemed to be extremely important, but the Emperor paid no attention to it, while his assistants tried to find out if the girl was still in the mansion. For some reason, the young men enthusiastically demanded that they not leave the room under any circumstances, and that if they weren't there, they should return immediately. Soon the Emperor managed to come to his senses, despite the cold curse burning in his chest. However, not even a day had passed since the heroine had promised to be his medicine, and now she was about to start a completely different life. The Emperor was surprised. Liana really remembered that she had promised to be his medicine, or he was outraged. She didn't drink that much. Now the lady was more worried about whether, if her power had really disappeared, she would be able to regain her abilities. The Emperor warned that they would probably have to ask the old man about this to find out the details. The old man was the same man Liana had already seen before on the communication stone. It was a young man with long black hair and a mustache, who at that very moment burst into her room with loud shouts. Liana certainly didn't expect to see him here, but as soon as he entered to introduce himself, she immediately realized that he was definitely an old man. He didn't come alone, but with another man who was in a hurry to talk to the Emperor. The heroes looked at the guests with surprise as they argued among themselves, and tried to figure out who should close the door immediately. The old men entered the room without warning and asked the Emperor to open the door for at least a second. Liana understood that the matter was probably serious, but she had no idea what all this meant. And probably, today, the doors of this mansion will definitely be broken down because of the indignant old men. The white old man and the black old man expressed their great respect and reverence for the lady. In response, Liana greeted the guests with a smile on her face, but one of the old men allowed her not to be so formal. The old man said that it happened that several nobles from the Duke's retinue found out about Liana's presence here, and unanimously created a commotion. The lady felt uneasy because of her, the Emperor had gotten into trouble. The old men did not understand why the lady was apologizing, since the Duke was the only one to blame for everything. It was the first time they had seen the Emperor hold someone's hand so carefully, as if nothing had happened. The black-haired old man was surprised that the Emperor was not entirely violent, and suggested returning to the palace to avoid meeting those people. At that moment, he noticed that His Majesty's ears were bright red, and something definitely happened here. Liana said that His Majesty was simply a little confused, but none of the old men could believe that the emperor was embarrassed. She spoke about her strength, which warmed the emperor, and also about how, after an incident, she weakened. Something definitely happened since then, and the girl had not mentioned it during her morning conversation with the old men. Upon hearing the strange news, the old man suggested finding out the details later, but for now, he offered to take the girl's hand. Touching her hand, he felt that the strength had definitely weakened, but it was recovering on its own, so Liana should recover soon. And until His Majesty starts getting angry, no problems should arise. The black old man confirmed that in that case they should not worry, and that it could happen. He didn't even have time to finish the sentence because, in the very next second, something happened that no one expected. The old man turned and saw someone trying to open the living room door, clearly wanting to enter. Indeed, a couple of seconds later, two men burst through the door and immediately headed for the emperor. The turquoise-haired young man shouted, "Even if His Majesty is the emperor, his behavior is beyond all limits." Indignant, the emperor decided to send the duke to a certain death, unarmed, just for a light slap in the face of his lover. The emperor abruptly moved away from the young man, who kept insisting that the duke was a very sensitive person, and that this act was cruel to him. This young man just performed a great feat. He dared to touch the emperor himself. Immediately, a cold, frosty spot appeared on my wrist, and huge snowflakes began to swirl around me. Enoch quickly tried to warn the lady that everything was fine. It was just a light touch that would not cause serious consequences. The old man shouted that the young man was allowing himself to do that, and that, even if he was annoyed, he shouldn't have touched the emperor. His manners were truly disrespectful, and it all happened just because the emperor refused to receive this man. A fierce wolfish smile appeared on his face, and the young man himself was exhausted from indignation and anger. But the old men noticed that even in all this chaos, the lady remained steadfast by the emperor's side, without taking a single step back. Bad rumors were already circulating about Liana, and this man was sure that it was not surprising that the duke had to take such measures. One of them was even terribly worried if the prepared food would be to the master's liking. The emperor said that if the young men were so worried, why didn't they go with the duke to the battlefield? And he even promised to open a teleportation portal for them. None of them wanted this outcome. One began to insist that everything was perfectly fine with him, and that he was not in the best physical shape, and the other had no documents. At that moment, the emperor closed his eyes and seemed to choke, and Liana realized that he definitely didn't feel well. The knight's neck was covered with a white icy frost, but he kept insisting that he was fine. Liana didn't understand what she had to do, and no matter how much she touched the emperor, he didn't warm up at all. If this continues, the nobles will realize that something is wrong with His Majesty, and that a terrible secret needed to be hidden. The emperor got worse with every passing minute, and Liana, looking at the helpless man, did not understand what to do or how to help him. One of the old men began to indicate something, pointing his fingers at his own mouth, trying to explain to the girl what to do. For some reason, he pointed at his lips, and she was probably supposed to do something with the emperor's lips. She tried to understand what the old man meant by this, but she couldn't grasp it at all. Liana's expression seemed to become increasingly foolish, but she definitely heard them talking about lips. The old man realized that the girl definitely did not hear his words, and he decided to explain it to her with hand gestures. He joined his two index fingers, and the gesture could only mean one thing. At that moment, the old man was offering Liana to kiss the emperor to alleviate his terrible curse. Of course, the heroine agreed to be Enoch's cure, but still, she thought the kiss was too much. She didn't have time to think at all, because the emperor's face had already begun to turn to ice. Enoch found himself in this situation because he had helped the girl yesterday, and she realized that now she had to help him. She touched his face with her hands, and to stop this madness, she had to kiss him right now. Liana even warned him that there was no romance involved, and that this was just part of the treatment he desperately needed at that moment. Liana brushed her lips against Enoch's. She felt an icy cold run through her veins, but at the same time, a wave of warmth emanated from Enoch. The cold was so piercing that the girl even felt like she was being cut with sharp needles from the inside. She understood that the emperor must be suffering even more now, and she had to help him. When she pulled away, the emperor breathed tremulously, and the blue color on his face began to disappear. The icy patterns began to melt. She did it. She saved the emperor, But now what will happen to the heroine, and what does this kiss mean to them? Liana, scared, said that the emperor almost lost his composure in front of all the guests. And old men. As soon as the young man woke up, he only saw Liana's sweet face, as well as the warm touch of her lips. The magic of her kiss was woven into a complex pattern, fighting the curse that was destroying the emperor. This kiss, an act of selfless bravery, revealed a completely new facet of Liana to him. The emperor felt like a child who had just experienced true beauty for the first time. And true courage. Liana tried to convince herself that it was just a treatment and asked if the emperor felt the cold, because the kiss definitely worked. And only now did she realize that the other heroes had been watching them intently this whole time, and that she had just kissed the emperor in front of them. People started discussing. The rumors were true, and just now the lady pounced on his majesty amidst the poor ones. She kissed him to prevent the imminent threat, but she didn't think about the consequences at all. The lady confessed to the emperor. Her face turned red. If this continues, the situation will get worse. Suddenly, someone present suggested that everyone calm down as quickly as possible to avoid trouble. The old men volunteered to stop this madness and understood that the emperor felt uncomfortable. They tried to help their master, but for some reason Liana felt awkward. The young men couldn't understand at all what was happening. Why His Majesty and the young lady kissed right in front of them. One of them remembered that at yesterday's banquet, the two were holding hands, and there were already too many rumors circulating throughout the empire. And only one thing came to everyone's mind, that definitely there was some kind of relationship between the emperor and this young lady. To calm the situation, one of the old men declared that the emperor was engaged to this girl, and that no one else should interfere in this matter. In a second, Liana's life changed drastically, and she couldn't believe how she ended up in such an absurd situation. The old men pretended not to understand anything, while thoughtfully chewing on chocolate cookies. Thanks to that feeling, everyone remained silent for now. But in that case, Liana would have had to become empress. The old man warned that for now, until everything was sorted out, it would be better for her to pretend to be in love. Enoch was incredibly sad about involving the girl in this, and she ended up in this mess precisely because of him. Liana did not want the young man to feel guilty under any circumstances, because she herself wanted to help him. She lowered her gaze, trying to hide her confusion, and the excitement that had suddenly awakened in her wanted to run away, to hide and think about everything that had happened. Her dark eyes, usually full of confidence, now seemed deeper, and she felt how that brief moment of pink lips changed everything. She admitted once again that she was actually worried about causing trouble for the emperor, but she was very happy to be able to help. The old men were sure that the situation could turn out quite favorably for the girl, because she needs to make contact to stop the uproar and His Majesty's terrible curse. And it would be more reasonable to have a reason for physical contact than to do it without any explanation. All this time, Liana was sure that Ariel was with the butler, but suddenly, a child's voice was heard in the living room. The girl managed to crawl here, probably while the butler was distracted for a moment. Ariel crawled out from behind the curtain and loudly said her first word, "Mom," to the entire living room. Lena was scared that the girl had managed to get in there, and it was no surprise that she couldn't find her after the partition collapsed. The baby sneezed. It's incredible that, while playing behind the curtains, you managed to inhale dust. The lady carefully took the girl in her arms because she was crawling directly towards her, and was happy to see her. An even sweeter smile appeared on the old men's faces for some reason. Everyone looked towards the lady. They clearly realized that the girl looked exactly like Liana, and she was perfectly aware of it. The only thought that came to the old men's minds was that this little girl was the lady's daughter. The eldest of the black-haired ones couldn't help but exclaim, "Could this really be the sweet son of His Majesty?" And the young lady. The heroes were already uncomfortable after the kissing situation, but now each of them felt even more terrible. None of the old men knew. They had only been holding hands for a month. Where could the child have come from? Even so, the man couldn't take his eyes off the girl, who looked incredibly like Liana. He said that this child, whom for some reason she calls Mommy, is the son of his cousin. At the most inopportune moment, for some reason, Ariel, who had previously been making incoherent sounds, now looked at the emperor and called him Daddy. An awkward silence hung over the heroes, and Liana couldn't explain why the girl called the emperor Daddy. It turns out she only really called Enoch Daddy, and those were the baby's first words. Liana asked the elders not to misunderstand her, assuring them that the little one still spoke very poorly. She pointed her little hand at the old men and loudly pronounced the word, "Grandpa." She happily looked at the pieces of bread and named them, and almost said the word choco. The old man noticed that the girl was very intelligent for her age and spoke very well, but Ariel categorically refused to call the emperor and the lady by their names, and only called them mommy and daddy. In any case, she was the daughter of Liana's cousin, who was simply staying with her for a while, so she asked the old men not to draw strange conclusions. The old men began to discuss out loud that everything was fine, and that there were still many opportunities, and that they could definitely make them a reality. In any case, they considered it a blessing, because the young lady managed to appease His Majesty. She asked the old men about the piece of ice in his heart, and asked if they could get rid of it. The heroes had already seen that physical contact during an attack warmed the emperor. But beyond that, she understood what they knew. One of the old men had a hunch, but wanted to study it further before making any declarations. Another old man asked to establish contact and touch the emperor to see everything with his own eyes. He was even sure that Eliana should hold the emperor's hand on every occasion, to hug him and do whatever was necessary to melt his heart. Still, it was surprising, and as far as the old men knew, the girl had no fire abilities. This is exactly what the emperor was going to ask, and magic is needed to melt the ice in his heart. He even suggested that perhaps the girl's fire ability was really inside her, but it was probably stolen by someone. Liana didn't expect things to turn out this way, and she really has strong abilities. The emperor decided to tell the old men that when the lady touched Liana, he felt the power inside her suddenly disappear. Indeed, it was true, the girl admitted. She felt like something had really left her body. The old men thought about it, and this option was quite possible. But it was only necessary for the person who wanted to suppress the lady's magical abilities. One of them asked if Liana had noticed anything strange when she came into contact with the lady. Trying to recall every small detail of that conversation, the girl remembered an important detail. On the lady's hand was a silver ring with a huge stone, something she noticed that day. Eliseo wore a ring with a red gemstone that seemed to emit a ruby glow during their conversation. The moment the ring touched her skin, she felt as if something had been torn away from her, as if something had disappeared inside her. Upon hearing about the red gem, the old men began to speak excitedly. They probably knew something about this. The white-haired old man suddenly asked the emperor to return to the palace for a moment and use the teleportation portal. He disappeared literally the next second, and Liana realized that things were probably serious. The old man went to the palace and returned by teleportation with a wooden box decorated with gold carvings. As soon as the heroine told him about the red ruby, he decided to bring this box. Remembering the girl's words, there was a huge gemstone on black velvet inside the box, and the old man asked if it was similar to the one Liana had seen on her sister. Looking closely at the stone, Liana realized that it was similar, but it was much smaller, and the color was more intense. She carefully decided to touch the magic stone with a finger to see if she felt the same thing. And as soon as she touched the huge ruby with the tip of her finger, she realized that she had experienced exactly the same sensations. The heroine had never felt this way before. She realized that she was completely fine, but something strange was happening to her. Judging by the expressions of the old men, they understood what was going on, and what effect the magic stone emitted. The huge ruby was called Dragon's Heart, and it wasn't just a jewel, but a stone that hid mysteries. The heroine knew nothing about this stone, and this was the first time she had heard the name Dragon's Heart. It seemed that the gemstone she saw on Eliseo was indeed a dragon's heart, and depending on the dragon's affiliation, this stone was capable of absorbing the power that suited it. Liana didn't understand what all this meant, but the emperor knew that it seemed the old man was right, because the emperor no longer felt the burning power of the girl, which acted on him like a strong current. Like before, Liana had no abilities, but despite the old men's surprise, they realized that the young lady had a magical gift. It was very possible that something had changed when the heroine entered this body, and now magic was truly raging inside her. But most of all, Liana was afraid that if she interrupted the course of the novel, it could end badly for all the characters. The old man asked to look at the magic stone and asked if the girl could see the flame inside it. This flame was Liana's power, which took shape after being absorbed by the dragon's heart. Most likely, the gem that was in the lady's ring was a fragment of a dragon's heart. passed down from generation to generation in the duke's family. The emperor asked if that stone was exactly the same as the one the girl had seen before at Elisio's place. The shine of the magic stone was exactly the same, but the lady's stone was of a redder color, and the stone itself was a bright blood-red color. The emperor thought so. The duke's fragment probably became dull over generations. Its power probably faded too. This explanation was quite logical, and this time Liana was not in such a bad situation, and she was still conscious. But that stone was as scarlet as thick blood, and she remembered it clearly. The old men then assumed that this red tint could only mean one thing, and they were completely sure of it. If the heart was extracted recently, its color will be blood red, but the older it is, the more its color and strength will fade. The old man hadn't heard any recent news about the dragon's death, although another remembered a recent incident. The white-haired old man recounted the rumors. There are rumors everywhere. The western forest dragon died unexpectedly. Unexpectedly, hearing this, the emperor looked at the old men in surprise, and he himself heard this information for the first time. He asked if it was really the fool who was so reckless and careless. The old man said that the emperor was indeed right. It was about Lord Carcass, and they said that he was missing his heart. Although no one was sure of it, his heart really disappeared, and Liana noticed that Ariel began to behave strangely. It was also said that the dragon was expecting offspring, but only one case was found, which means that either the child escaped with the mother, or it was false information. Suddenly, little Liana started crying, and the emperor declared that the Lord never listened to him when he said not to trust everyone. It is very possible that the stone in the young lady's ring is indeed a dragon's heart, but Liana couldn't understand where Elisio got something like that, and who knows? Maybe he just stumbled upon it by accident. The emperor was probably restless, thinking that if only he could kill the western dragon and take its heart for selfish purposes. In any case, the old men asked the girl to be careful and that, if she saw such a jewel again, she should know that it was capable of solving her problems. The emperor warned them to avoid contact with the young lady, at least until they found out why she had this object. But above all, the heroine was worried about little Ariel and really wanted the investigation to be carried out as quickly as possible. Now the heroine knew the terrible truth about Elisio and realized that she really needed to be more careful. As soon as the old man said the words about Lord Carcass, little Ariel suddenly started crying loudly. Liana couldn't understand why the girl was behaving this way and what happened to her at that moment. The emperor suggested that perhaps the baby was hungry, as she had spilled her milk, and she was not full at all. Having decided to be absent for a while, Liana went to feed the baby, and the emperor offered to accompany her. The heroine decided that everything would be fine, and everything would go faster if she went alone. Enoch became even more worried, and asked the lady to be careful and not fall somewhere in a hurry. The young man gently touched her face and looked into her eyes with concern, and Liana promised to be as careful as possible. The faces of the old men expressed complete affection as they watched the affectionate relationship between the emperor and the girl. One of the old men shouted at the lady not to forget something, and the heroine was afraid she had forgotten something again. The black-haired old man reminded the heroine once again that to melt the ice in His Majesty's heart, something needed to be done. Specifically, Liana must touch the emperor as often as possible so that the magic fragment finally melts, while another old man asked her not to focus only on the child, but to solve other problems. The emperor gently covered her mouth with his hand and asked Liana once again to take care of herself. Now the lady was worried. The baby had been crying this whole time, as if about to faint, and it was good that she had finally calmed down. Anyone who saw this would definitely think that this was some kind of wedding ceremony. The old men continued to admire the young lady, and the emperor decided to have a serious conversation with them. He asked for their attention for a moment, and, judging by the emperor's threatening look, one thing was obvious. As soon as the lady left the room, his face became cold and threatening again, and the old men understood that a serious conversation awaited them. He decided to discuss an important topic with them and requested an investigation into the connection between the Harrington Duchy and Liana. The old men were surprised, because even if it was a connection between the duchy and the young lady, it could be an ordinary relationship. The emperor did not think so. It seemed to him that it was not the first time the duke had raised his hand against Liana, which was scandalous in itself. He asked them to address the issue responsibly and find out if there was anything they didn't know about Liana's abilities. And Elisha, the old men, told the emperor not to worry and promised to find out everything, down to how many spoons the duke's family had. The emperor understood that this would be unnecessary, but he believed that the wise old men could solve this problem. After all, up to this point, he knew absolutely nothing about Liana and her family. The emperor was blinded by the fact that the girl could suppress the ice fragment, and he didn't think about anything else the whole time. And in his thoughts floated that tender and unexpected kiss and the touch of Liana's velvety lips. The old men noticed that the emperor blushed thinking about this, and even thought that perhaps the emperor had caught a cold, and it was necessary to call the royal doctor. A few days later, early in the morning, Liana was drinking green tea, but her face clearly showed confusion. Several days had already passed since she suddenly became the emperor's fake mistress, and since that day, he hadn't come near her again. Recently, he was chasing Liana at every opportunity, begging her to touch him, and wouldn't leave her side for a single step. Liana wondered what was the point of agreeing to be his medicine if the one who needed healing didn't even deign to come near her. She said this out loud, and the stunned emperor even seemed to stop breathing after her words. Throughout this time, Liana was tormented by thoughts about the kiss. She couldn't understand what was happening, and she even decided that their kiss had been really so unpleasant that the emperor categorically refused to come near her. But she only did it because she was worried about the young man, and now he was definitely going too far. After this, the heroine tried to do everything possible to follow the elder's instructions to establish physical contact. But the emperor didn't move a finger after that. At the morning tea party, the black-haired old man admitted that a charity event would soon take place. Liana didn't understand what that had to do with it, and the old man asked the lady to attend this event as the emperor's companion. Even without this, the heroine was embarrassed to death, and now the old man wanted her to appear before everyone as his companion. Even though she was His Majesty's beloved just for show, the old man still insisted that the lady come. The old man assured that the emperor would wander completely alone, probably get into a fight with other couples without any reason, and touch something unusual without any precaution and get out of control. They even suggested that in that case, they would have to drag the emperor's frozen body back to the palace. But if the lady did not want to go at all, nothing could be done, and the old men had no choice but to endure the difficulties. The men managed to persuade Liana. And after these events, she said she would go with the emperor to the event. The old man was delighted, and he called this wonderful news, suggesting that the girl hurry up and get ready for the reception. Liana asked if they couldn't just call someone, but the old men took care of important matters. They described the heroes as young people who are always stuck in their houses, and that they definitely shouldn't miss the opportunity to take a walk together in the fresh air. Liana was worried about who would take care of little Ariel, who had been with them this whole time. The little girl waved her little hand and said goodbye to Liana, and something flew by as if going to play with her grandparents. The lady looked at Ariel with surprised eyes, because just now she had decided to play with the elders alone. Ariel could already say such short sentences, and children really grew up very fast. Some still doubted that the heroes were really a couple, and Liana said they would be lucky if they didn't look like sworn enemies. The emperor didn't even look her in the eye, and after these words, she noticed that the young man again turned red as a lobster. He still didn't say what was wrong, and avoided eye contact with Liana in every possible way. However, the heroine once promised that she would become his medicine and help the emperor avoid the terrible curse. The imperial city lived its ordinary and measured life, filled with beauty, harmony, and sophistication. The heroes went for a walk, and the lady noticed that calling the emperor by his name was a little strange. The old man warned that when they go out into the world, even if they are not affectionate, they should at least call each other by their first names. Liana decided that the most convenient thing would be to also call the young man Your Majesty, and simply return to the communication that had existed between them before. But the emperor categorically refused and asked the girl to call him by his name. But the heroine didn't hear his words because of the sound of the bells. A little embarrassed, the young man asked Liana to call him Enoch. For some reason, up until that moment, it had been incredibly difficult for the heroine to call him by his name. But everything turned out to be much easier. Lately, the emperor had become a little shy, and Liana had definitely noticed it. She agreed to call him by his name, asking him to follow her, but suddenly her friend stopped. and asked if she couldn't pronounce his name. Liana didn't understand what he wanted to achieve from her and asked if he was simply asking her to call him by his name. It wasn't that hard, but the girl offered to take his hand and promised to tell him her name. The emperor hesitated for a moment, and the lady assumed that he probably didn't want to take her hand. And she turned around. For some reason, Enoch was still there, his cheeks red and shining, and he continued to look at Liana. He took her hand, and the girl asked him if it was so easy, then why hadn't he done it before? Liana asked if the emperor was really offended by her, and she couldn't understand anything at all. Because the young man said nothing, he didn't even realize that she had said his name out loud, and a sweet smile appeared on the emperor's face. Liana laughed, and she had just said his name, and for some reason after that she felt incredibly amused. The emperor asked why this made the girl happy, but he, in turn, smiled back at her. Enoch admitted that a smile appeared on his face for a reason, undoubtedly, because he was simply happy. The young man hadn't heard his name in a long time. Nobody had pronounced it for so long, and he was simply happy about it. And for him now, it was normal happiness just to hear his name called. The emperor couldn't even imagine that it could be so pleasant, and the surprised Liana heard her heart beat. It was an incredibly sweet moment. Both heroes were embarrassed by what was happening. It was even difficult for them to look each other in the eyes. Liana decided to enter a certain shop first, but the heroes had no idea that someone was watching them the whole time. The stranger smelled precisely that scent that gave him goosebumps, and it was Liana's scent. During all this time, they were being watched by a young man with burgundy eyes and long silver hair, who immediately recognized Lady Harrington. For some reason, Liana suddenly felt nervous, and an overwhelming fear spread through every cell of her body. The emperor realized this immediately and could only guess what was happening. The heroes entered a cozy establishment to have a cup of tea and relax a little before their walk. The emperor was surprised, because all this time she had been eagerly drinking water, as if it were an alcoholic beverage, and the lady admitted that she was just trying to clear her head. Her words sounded too strange, and Enoch wondered what had happened to the girl during that time. She asked the emperor to forget it, and guessed that he must have been scared because the young man suddenly brought his beautiful face close to hers. In fact, Liana was simply scared for no reason, and now she could finally calmly hold the emperor's hand. She touched his hand, and her heart began to beat so loudly that the lady even feared the emperor could hear that thump. But he resumed his duties, and after she called him by his name, the emperor began to look into her eyes more often, and even move closer. For some reason, he kept sneaking away, and Liana couldn't find an answer to this question, suggesting that the emperor simply have a sincere conversation. Liana asked why Enoch kept avoiding her, and if he was simply uncomfortable with her touch. After taking a sip of aromatic tea, Enoch admitted that the girl was definitely wrong in her opinion, and that couldn't be. In that case, he asked her to take his hand again, since the emperor hadn't touched her since then. She extended her hand in front of him and suddenly demanded that he finally touch her. The emperor noticed Liana's agitated state and asked her to sit down again. Promising to touch her hand, he removed his black leather glove, and a crimson blush appeared on his cheeks from embarrassment. He gently touched her skin, incredibly pleasant with his fingertips, and she felt those emotions again. He touched her with a single finger, while Liana looked with bewilderment at everything that was happening. The heroine asked if the emperor really thought that this could be considered a proper touch. She didn't hear what the old man said, who advised her to make contact as often as possible to find out how well the ice was melting. The heroine wasn't sure if she could scold the emperor like that, but he simply replied, and acted completely differently. Liana was indignant. Did he seriously believe that such touches could melt such a terrible curse? And powerful, getting up from the table, the heroine admitted that touching bodies would be much more effective than using hands. Unexpectedly, Liana headed straight for the emperor, while the excited young man asked her to stop because they were in a cafe. Enoch was so confused that he suddenly confessed that it was all because his heart hurt. Liana heard this information for the first time and asked if the emperor really had a bad heart. She leaned on his chest to listen and asked how serious his illness was. The confused emperor watched the girl's behavior as he listened to his heartbeat and asked if he suffered from arrhythmia or something like that. The young man realized he couldn't take it anymore and said he wanted to go out for some fresh air. Judging by his behavior, Liana was scared of what was happening, and maybe everything was too serious. Suddenly, she felt a shiver run down her spine, and realized that there was definitely someone behind her. Looking back, the lady saw a man in a white robe with gold embroidery, but she definitely didn't recognize him. Looking more closely at the stranger, the heroine saw silver, almost white hair, as well as huge ruby eyes. She quietly said his name, Aaron, and continued to look at the mysterious guest with frightened eyes. A strange aura emanated from this man, and he just smiled mischievously and thanked the girl for the gift. The stranger approached Liana and bit her neck like a vampire. A powerful pulse of energy coursed through her body like lightning. Liana found herself completely defenseless against this sudden attack. The stranger, whose face was hidden by the shadow of his hood, did not take his eyes off her neck. She hit the young man hard on the head, shouting at him why he was acting like a complete psychopath. The stranger probably did not expect such daring behavior from the fragile girl who held his hair. A menacing grimace appeared on his face, and Liana held the bite on her neck with one hand, while with the other she firmly held the stranger's hair. This young man turned out to be the master of the magic tower called Aaron, and this character was well known to the heroine, the first important male character in the novel, and one of those who passionately hates Liana. And he is a kind of substitute for the tormentor Alicio. He was the type of guy who started kissing Alicio on the neck in broad daylight, which is why Liana always tried to avoid him and shouted at him to finally leave her alone. She grabbed his hair with both hands and ordered him to let go, promising him that she would definitely leave him her silver locks. Liana warned again that she had asked him to let go the easy way, but she didn't understand why this man had attacked her, even though Alicio wasn't there. For some reason, Aaron demanded to enjoy another bite, but the heroine persistently demanded that he leave her alone as quickly as possible. She shouted loudly and called him a real maniac. The next second, the young man received a blow to the head from the fragile lady. Aaron was perplexed because he was sure that the girl should accept it and not refuse to bite her again. Liana said that the young man was behaving too strangely and biting her neck upon first meeting like a real pervert. Aaron admitted that he simply couldn't resist, because while walking through the city, he smelled something very tasty and aromatic. That's why he found Liana and decided to try to enjoy her blood, while all the guests of the establishment watched intently. In the original, Aaron bit the main character on the neck the first time they met, and he wasn't himself from the beginning. Who knows what this could lead to? And the lady decided that she needed to get him out of there before the emperor noticed. But as soon as she thought about it, she realized that Enoch was already standing next to them. Watching, the master of the magic tower opened his eyes in surprise as soon as the emperor approached them. Liana called the emperor by his name, and Harun asked her if she really didn't know who he was. And she was crazy. Harun confidently stated that the girl couldn't just shout His Majesty's name in front of all the city's people. Then he heard the emperor himself call the girl by her name, and this could only mean one thing. He called the girl that wayward cousin who was trying to destroy the noble lady, while Liana begged him to let her go. The master of the magic tower heard before that the girl had no skills, and she definitely couldn't resist him, but he couldn't understand one thing: why she smelled so delicious, and why he was attracted to that scent of strong magic. Harun looked at the girl's neck again and realized that everything that was happening was too strange. Liana pushed the young man away from her neck again and shouted that he was allowing himself to do that in front of the emperor. During all this time, Enoch remained silent, observing the behavior of the master of the magic tower, whom he knew well. The young man approached and severely told the master to immediately move away from Liana and stop bothering her. Only half an hour ago, the emperor was standing in the courtyard of the establishment, breathing fresh air and trying to sort out his thoughts. Enoch just wished he would never die, as the blush continued to spread across his face. The emperor incredibly wanted to touch this girl, but it seemed he couldn't, and he waited for that strange feeling to pass. According to the old man, if he continues to live as usual, everything will get better soon. But if the ice melts, side effects may occur. The young man had noticed a long time ago that since that day, his body had been behaving very strangely. The old men tried to ask the master if he was really sure about this, but the emperor couldn't explain what had happened because he himself couldn't really understand it. Since kissing Liana, every time he saw her, his heart beat wildly, his face burned, even if they didn't touch. And as soon as their gazes met, all his thoughts instantly disappeared. And he told the old men about this. Even when Liana wasn't around, he kept thinking about her and her velvety lips. And tender, The emperor said that this seemed unusual to him, and that his heart always stirred when he saw that girl. The old man then admitted that it looked like a healing reaction, but he was sure that it was not like that at all. The healing reaction is a natural reaction that occurs as the body recovers. So the old man assured that there was no need to worry too much. The black old man was indignant. The healing reaction sounded ridiculous, and the white old man insisted that he was ruining all the fun. They understood that it was not difficult at all, until the emperor asked what he should do then, and if he should simply continue as before. The old men said that as long as the emperor maintains regular contact with Lady Liana, he will be able to recover in the shortest possible time. Enoch was the most worried. At this rate, his heart might not be able to stand it at first, but he might recover soon. Although this was a test of his recovery, for some reason this thought did not comfort him in the least. Now that the emperor had felt the warmth once again, when he saw Liana, he wanted to approach her and ask her to touch him. This happened especially when the girl approached him. His face began to burn even before she touched him. When he was alone, he managed to calm down, and maybe everything happened due to his rapid heartbeat. Perhaps the emperor decided that he should turn to the old men for something that could slow down his pulse. As soon as he returned to the cozy cafe, he saw a stranger eagerly grabbing Lady Liana by the neck. This sight shocked the emperor, who immediately approached to find out what was happening. As soon as Aaron saw the emperor, he immediately stepped one pace away from the girl. Looking at him with frightened eyes, he admitted that it was pure chance, and that he had simply remembered something extremely urgent. It immediately became clear that the young man was going to flee, but he simply bit the girl on the neck, and didn't even apologize. After opening the magic portal, the master of the magic tower suddenly disappeared without a trace, and he swore that it wasn't on purpose. Seriously, the heroine has met all sorts of weirdos in her life, but this one turned out to be the weirdest. The emperor approached Liana to make sure she was all right, and the heroine noticed his worried face. There were visible bite marks on her neck, and scarlet blood dripped from the small wounds. For some reason, Enoch asked a very strange question, and wondered if Lady Diana had also stroked the master of the tower. There was deep sadness on his face, and he wanted to know if Lady Diana had touched him too. This time, too many strange things happened during the walk, and the heroes returned quietly in the carriage. On the way, Liana looked out the window and looked thoughtful, and didn't say a word. After a while, she asked the emperor if he was upset about something that had happened that day. Enoch looked at the girl with concern, but admitted that he was completely fine. But Liana felt that the emperor was blatantly lying, and had been like this since she told him what happened to the master of the tower. During all this time, the emperor seemed to have lost his mind, and even seemed to be lost in space. Suddenly, the young man admitted that, frankly, he wasn't entirely sure of his words, and probably felt something else. The young man said that he felt strange sensations. Something was pressing on his chest, as if something was stuck there. But the emperor didn't understand at all what this feeling was, because he had never experienced anything like it before. After hearing his explanation, Liana suggested that maybe it was similar to a feeling of frustration. Since it was the first time the emperor experienced this, he frankly had no idea what was happening to him. They had a rather sincere conversation, and Enoch told her that since he met Liana, everything was new to him. Holding someone's hand, laughing while looking into their eyes, and simply enjoying the ordinary moments of life. Even when Liana said his name for the first time today, his heart began to beat faster, and the emperor felt such warmth for the first time. All this was unusual and foreign to him, because before he was a cold-blooded person who felt neither emotions nor pain. It was the first time the heroine had heard such frank words from the emperor, and this time he truly opened up to her. She had previously assumed that his life was different because he couldn't touch others, but perhaps he lived a much lonelier life than she had imagined. And if that feeling he was experiencing now is what people call a disorder, then it could only happen for one reason. Because the emperor saw Liana interacting with another young man, this is what influenced his condition. Liana warned again that what happened before was a pure accident, and she had already explained everything. But seeing her touch someone else, not him, the emperor felt incredible pain. Placing his hand on his chest, he admitted that he felt something heavy resting on his heart. It might have sounded childish, like a unanimous childish whim, but the young man spoke of his feelings for the first time. Ileana was simply the only one he could touch, and it certainly didn't sound childish. Even though she knew it was completely normal, The mere fact that a girl could touch someone still caused him some pain. This is what it feels like when your first friend finds another friend, and for the emperor, Liana was probably the first friend he ever had. After getting involved in this affair, she was the first person he spoke to here. And Liana felt the same way. Now, the emperor certainly didn't expect Liana to sincerely confess her feelings in response. She even got up from her seat and loudly declared that he was the one for her too. The silence was oppressive. Making her heart beat fast, Liana slowly raised her head and met his piercing eyes. In them she always saw a reflection of her own soul, restless, seeking peace, thirsty for understanding. Therefore, the heroine confidently replied that she doesn't touch just anyone, and that she only touches the emperor. And Ariel. And she certainly didn't pat the master of the magic tower, the cunning little fox, but practically pulled all his hair out. Liana frankly told the emperor that he was the only adult man whose head she had patted, and she promised that it would continue this way in the future, and that the young man definitely shouldn't worry about it. A cheerful and joyful smile lit up the emperor's face, and he decided without hesitation to trust this girl. For some reason, during this conversation, the heroine's heart beat wildly, and she was worried that at this rate, the young man would also hear it. The emperor took the girl's hand, but she understood that this was the precise moment when he needed to pull away. Enoch asked if that meant only he was allowed to touch Liana and no other young man. Technically, that was true, and Liana understood that she had just signed her own words. The young man approached the lady and observed her neck, where the bite marks were visible. Liana was afraid of such close contact, but deep down she trusted the emperor. He touched her with his hand and removed the trace of the magic tower master's touch. So he decided that the bite must also be removed definitely. He wanted to be the only one to touch her and couldn't stand the competition. When he wanted to touch her neck, Liana got scared by the touch and shouted at him, asking what he was doing. The young man simply laughed and asked the girl to be careful, because she might fall at any moment. As soon as he touched her neck with his fingertips, the young man realized that this wound definitely needed to be treated. When he touched it, he felt a strange pain that seemed to pierce his entire body. The small bite had swollen quite a bit and started to hurt more and more with every passing minute. The emperor realized that if he had been there from the beginning, none of this would have happened, and he felt incredibly sorry. In this situation, the young man could soon definitely hear Liana's heartbeat, so he asked her to step aside a little. But burying his face in the girl's shoulder, Enoch felt that he would like to stay in that moment, and just a little longer. Now he finally felt alive again, while the heroine felt like she was dying. And where did that guy who blushed and trembled with a simple touch go, who now skillfully sat her on his lap? Sitting on his lap, Liana was worried why the young man kept saying her name. Suddenly, the young man asked if Liana had meant what she said during the conversation just now. He said that she promised that only he could really touch her, and that no other young man would approach her. It doesn't matter that the heroine said that to calm him down, but now it has become quite difficult to deny. So, for Enoch to finally calm down, she tenderly said that only he could really touch her. The emperor asked the lady to promise that from now on she would not allow anyone but him to touch her. It didn't even sound like an ultimatum, so Liana happily promised to do exactly that. She needed proof not only with nice words, but also with actions. Liana didn't understand why words alone weren't enough, and if there was some kind of tradition or imperial etiquette for this. She decided to use a simpler method, and, extending her little finger, declared that it was better to reinforce the words this way. The emperor saw the strange gesture for the first time and didn't understand what he should do now. Liana showed with her fingers that it was necessary to link their little fingers and make a promise. And in this case, the oath would be impossible to break. It was something like a vow, a promise, secured by a hand gesture, and could be said exactly that way. Enoch had never encountered anything like this before, but he trusted the girl and prepared to take off his black leather glove. After a brief hesitation, the young man realized that taking off the glove would not be a good decision. But the most wonderful solution would be to seal this oath with the little fingers of both hands. He crossed his little finger and asked if he was doing everything right. At that moment, the young man really felt something strange and magical. Liana laughed and declared that now there was an official oath between them that had to be fulfilled. It was very sweet. The emperor couldn't believe if all this was true, and if everything was really that simple. Liana warned that now whoever breaks the promise will be obliged to fulfill any wish of the other. She patted his hair, noticing that it stuck out in strange and funny ways. She continued to mess up his hair, but the emperor seemed to enjoy it more and more. For some reason, he smiled happily despite the fact that the heroine was teasing him about the mess on his head. The emperor admitted that he was truly happy for the first time in his life, and he felt it with every cell in his body. To be honest, when he saw Liana with the master of the tower, for a moment he felt a little scared. Fearing that someone might take Liana away, the emperor felt strong emotions. But now he knew that only he could be close to her. And perhaps it was for this simple reason that he couldn't stop smiling and continued to hug the beautiful lady. And most importantly, Liana now couldn't understand how this nice guy could turn into a tyrant. Of course, Enoch has not yet become a full-fledged tyrant, but he is still the same bloodthirsty guy from the novel who danced with a blood-soaked sword. The lady decided to dot the i's regarding what happened before, and she asked the young man not to do what he did with his lips again. The young man's puzzled face expressed surprise, while the lady assured him that it was very easy to do. And tenderly squeezing against her shoulder, the young man couldn't understand how this girl was going to survive in such a cruel world. In any case, as long as they were together, no one would dare to think anything bad about them. The lady carefully patted his head until the young man couldn't escape those hugs despite having just arrived. Soon a solemn day of charity arrived in the empire, which was celebrated by all residents of the empire. The emperor attended the event with Liana, who looked incredibly cute today in a delicate blue dress. The heroine was always beautiful, and that's no secret, and she knew she was beautiful, even without the emperor's words. She even said it out loud, and the young man laughed, as he seemed to be the only one who didn't know this well-known fact. And just now, he was talking as if he were joking with her, and at that moment, voices were heard in the room. It was the old men and the little girl who saw the heroes off to a charity event. The baby once again called them Mom and Dad, although Liana had previously warned Ariel not to do it again. The emperor asked the girl to leave her alone and allow her to say whatever she wanted. But Liana was afraid that someone might overhear her and misunderstand. The heroes looked like a happy family, but the heroine didn't need any more unnecessary rumors. And she was worried. Seeing Liana's serious face, the little girl stared at her, and it seemed as if she was about to burst into tears the next moment. The little girl got scared and asked if she had done something wrong, fearing she would be scolded. After patting the baby's head, the lady declared that she had no intention of scolding her, and that she never had in her life. In fact, Arya was simply a wonderful child, and Liana called her the most beautiful girl in the world. The old men were worried if the heroes would be able to cope with their duties, while Liana was worried if the old men would be able to cope with Ariel. One of them admitted that it wasn't the first time they had encountered children, and that the lady had no reason to worry that the little one would have a great time. Since the baby was not officially recognized by the ducal family, she couldn't take Ariel to the official event, so she had to ask the old men to look after the girl. The lady was about to resort to the mansion servants, but the old men were more than happy to stay with the baby, admitting that at their age, crowded places were already exhausting. Things were incredibly calm before the event, and the heroine felt very good before leaving. She asked the little girl to promise not to cause too much trouble for the old people, and after her words, the little girl made such a serious face that, looking into her small eyes, one could really believe it. The lady was sure that the girl would manage perfectly fine without her, but she still approached again and asked. She asked her to behave well and carefully tied beautiful scarves onto her pink dress. The emperor approached the lady and informed her that a carriage was already waiting for them, and the little girl had just finished saying goodbye to Ariel. But today she saw a new emperor before her, in an incredibly luxurious official suit. At first, the young man didn't understand what was happening, as she opened her eyes in surprise and stared at his clothes. He awkwardly adjusted the brooch on the imperial robe and asked if something was wrong. Liana immediately noticed the change in Enoch's appearance. His hair was styled completely differently, but it still looked quite neat. But as soon as Liana left the palace, she saw that the window was not properly closed, and she decided to go back to call the servants. The event was about to start, and the heroes had no time for other people's business. The heroine returned to the manor and saw little Ariel sitting calmly in the arms of the old people. At that moment, they noticed something strange and realized that the emperor definitely could not appear before the guests looking like that. And if he appears with disheveled and uncombed hair, he will surely cause some ridiculous rumors. Liana decided to take matters into her own hands and asked the emperor for permission to slightly adjust his appearance. She carefully adjusted the brooch and wondered what she had done to make it suddenly so messy. Other guests were also slowly arriving at the imperial palace, and one of them, in a snow-white carriage. It was Prince Cargill. His bright red suit, emerald brooch, and the huge bow on his neck betrayed his aristocratic manners. The assistant noticed that the prince was in a very good mood today, and it was obvious even to him. The prince was truly incredibly happy, because he hadn't experienced such feelings in his life for a long time. This was probably due to the fact that he hadn't visited the empire for a long time, and he was simply in a slightly pleasant anticipation. Cargill, the second prince of the kingdom of Gamel, was especially excited about his appearance. The young man had visited the empire when he was very young and had never imagined that his return would take so long. His anticipation was equal to the time he spent in long waiting before meeting the inhabitants of the empire. The assistant warned that the prince must be careful with His Majesty the Emperor. Unlike the previous emperor, there are rumors that the current emperor has a very eccentric character and should be treated differently. Upon hearing the words about eccentricity, the young man involuntarily laughed, and he kept forgetting that His Majesty had become emperor. Be that as it may, the assistant warned not to touch the emperor under any circumstances, and there are rumors that anyone who dared to do such a thing would be permanently eliminated. Therefore, he was worried that everything was fine with the prince, and he would not disobey the rules under any circumstances. The assistant warned that, if the first prince found out that Cargill had arrived in the empire, there could be talk. He was really worried that this could affect the reputation of the prince's family. Cargill simply asked the young man not to worry and stated that this time everything would definitely turn out well. Everything will be fine on one condition, that his assistant keeps his mouth shut and tells no one. Of course, his assistant was ready to fulfill any request from the prince, and he promised that everything would be exactly like that. The carriage approached the imperial father, and the prince noticed that the dome's blue color was incredibly beautiful. A charity party was being held in the luxurious imperial garden, with crystal chandeliers reflecting the sunlight, making the jewels shine even brighter. Amidst this gallant hustle and bustle, ladies dressed in silks and velvets were eagerly discussing the arrival of a new guest. All the attention of the guests was focused on the appearance of His Majesty, the Emperor, and the young Viscountess who accompanied him. The Emperor noticed that the girl's face was flushed, as if she wasn't feeling well, even though it wasn't too hot today. Liana admitted she was fine, and that the Emperor would be pleased to take back her beautiful fan. But for some reason, the young man insisted that the fan was too heavy, and if the girl held it constantly, she could injure her wrist. The heroine wasn't as weak as she looked, but the Emperor was still worried about her condition. He touched her face with his hand in front of everyone, and the guests noticed that His Majesty was fanning the girl with such tender words. He had never paid attention to women before, and there were even rumors that he would be alone his entire life. But no one could have imagined that the Emperor could be so affectionate. Embarrassed, Liana took the Emperor's hand and asked him to behave more modestly so that no one would think anything unnecessary. She was incredibly shy because an incredible number of guests were watching her while the Emperor carefully fanned her. Enoch didn't even immediately understand what was happening, but Liana warned him that everyone was watching them. But the Emperor was absolutely indifferent to the empty and absurd rumors that might circulate after their appearance. Although the Emperor had to maintain dignity, he decided to do what his heart dictated. Liana admitted she was fine and asked the young man to hurry up and fulfill his duties so that his reputation wouldn't be damaged. Enoch was still standing nearby and wanted to know if the girl would really continue to call him by that name throughout the entire celebration. He was a majestic emperor, but all the guests saw that the girl spoke to him too naturally. She even apologized if she had been rude and decided to ask for forgiveness to avoid misunderstandings. The young man was still standing in front of her and leaned even closer to her sweet and gentle face, with the question of whether she really has to explain everything and doesn't care at all what they think of him now. Liana certainly didn't expect the Emperor to treat her with such tenderness in front of so many aristocrats. Looking into his eyes, she noticed that the young man had always been dazzlingly handsome, but today he looked incredibly sweet, perhaps because the Emperor was in formal attire and looked even more magnificent today. The Emperor warned the lady once again not to call him by his title under any circumstances. but simply by his first name. It was an official event, and Liana still couldn't afford to call His Majesty that. But now, the emperor didn't care at all, and admitted that lovers can call each other by their first name. Even though they were not an actual couple, he asked the girl not to call him by his title anymore. They were in the center, surrounded by a crowd of guests closely watching the emperor's behavior. The heroine perfectly understood that they were in an unusual situation, and that, without a doubt, this could not continue forever. When the ice melts and the emperor can return to normal life, they will no longer be in love. The play will be over. This means that for everything to turn out as it should, they need to be very, very careful, especially in the presence of other aristocrats. They were still standing there looking at each other, but at that moment, Liana felt a strange chill run down her spine. The emperor's expression instantly changed, and the girl had no idea what could have happened in that second. But now his sweet face was replaced by a cold-blooded grimace, and everything around him seemed to be covered in eternal ice. It was the first time the heroine saw the emperor suddenly angry, and this was immediately clear from his facial expressions. Panic seized the girl, she called Novena, asked her to give birth, and asked if everything was okay. She had a fan in her hand that cracked and broke in a second, and the girl was worried that the emperor might get hurt. The young man only uttered one word, asking her name, while Liana was completely beside herself. Now he just wanted the girl to call him by his name again, and declared that only then would he let her go. Sometimes, the young man really behaved strangely, and probably didn't realize how this might look from his side. She called him by his name, and asked if she could now open her hand where the broken fan lay. The emperor now looked like a little boy who, for the first time in his life, was offended, or angry about something. The fan broke into many small pieces, and Liana couldn't understand if he was really offended, because she simply didn't call him by his name. Fortunately, thanks to the glove, her hand was not injured, but after that, the wood splinters could easily get into her hand. At that moment, a man approached the heroes who had been looking for the emperor for a long time, and longed to meet him. The young man, holding a glass in his hand, introduced himself as Karthal, the second prince of the kingdom of Gamel, and said it was a great honor for him to meet the emperor. He had an incredibly gentle and beautiful face that was easy to remember, but Liana saw him for the first time, and yet his face seemed familiar to her. The emperor stated that he didn't understand why Prince Hamel was looking for him, but the young man had already heard about His Majesty. They shook hands, and after all, the kingdom's empires had maintained important trade relations for a long time. The prince decided to ask the emperor for more patronage for his future crystal mana trade. In fact, the young man sincerely wanted to meet the emperor to personally express his respect. By pure chance, at the next second he tripped, and the contents of the glass scattered in all directions. The splashes reached the emperor, and the prince perfectly understood that the emperor could now be met with furious anger. It turned out that he carelessly spilled everything over the emperor's glove, and no one could have expected this. The prince was scared, and so excited about making a mistake that he deeply regretted what had happened. Prince Hamel simply spilled his drink, and the emperor admitted that it was a trifle. Just in case, he even brought spare gloves and stated that absolutely nothing terrible had happened. There were terrible rumors about Enoch, and everyone was sure that the prince would now face angry punishment. Enoch tried to find his gloves in his pocket, but apparently forgot because he relaxed, and thought he was not in any danger. Carol felt terribly uncomfortable, and said that the emperor had prepared a special gift for him. Behind him was an assistant who, with his eyes downcast, held a blue velvet box in his hands. But the emperor turned around and stated that he would be willing to accept the gift later, when he had free time. Carol assured that this gift was prepared with the deepest sincerity, and that he would very much like the emperor to accept it. He bowed his head to him and had no intention of darkening the celebration on this joyful day of charitable celebration. Cargill respectfully looked into the emperor's eyes and asked if he could ask him to moderate his anger and kindly accept his gift. Behind the emperor's back, the guests whispered that the prince's actions were too abrupt even for the emperor. It was known to everyone that the empire had a large number of contracts with the kingdom of Gamel. Therefore, the emperor had no choice but to gratefully accept the prince's conditions. The luxurious box contained black leather gloves with gold embroidery, decorated with first-class mana stones. Mined only this season, Karen prepared them because he had heard that His Majesty always wore gloves and was happy to be the one to bring them to the event. The emperor was interested in his gift because these gloves were unusual. Liana immediately noticed that the stone sewn on them looked like that bright blood-red ruby. Enoch approached the prince to take a closer look at the stone on the gloves. Liana quickly realized that something was wrong and shouted loudly that the emperor must not wear them under any circumstances. She saw Enoch's frightened face, who probably didn't even suspect that something strange could be happening there. The girl looked at the emperor with concern and tried to make him understand that this could really be very dangerous. Karjal, for his part, pretended not to understand anything at all, and that he just wanted to present a gift to the emperor. But at the next second, a malicious smile appeared on his face, and he asked what was going on there. Liana approached the box and declared that the emperor must not put on those gloves until Enoch understood what was happening. Now she understood where the strange sense of déjà vu that had accompanied her since the beginning of the event came from. There was an episode in the novel where the emperor, after putting on these gloves, went crazy in front of everyone, and the story was told from Alicio's point of view. So it is understandable that Liana knew absolutely nothing about it. She was absolutely sure that these gloves were the cause of the uproar. But it had to happen after Enoch's return. But for some reason, it was happening right now. She didn't even notice how she started biting her lips out of nervousness. And Enoch carefully approached her and asked her to calm down. He didn't understand why Liana suddenly became so serious and worried, because these were just common gloves. In currents, Carol asked if the emperor had any problems, and he was not willing to accept his gift. The emperor warned that everything was in order, and that he would gratefully accept these gloves. Standing behind the young man, the girl didn't know what to do. She didn't know anything else, no detailed information, but at the next second she felt very unwell. Liana made a grimace of pain. The emperor rushed to help her and couldn't understand what had happened. The girl perfectly understood that her reputation was irreparably ruined the moment the emperor refused the gift. She grabbed a glass of alcohol and began to drink it eagerly, and during all this time she didn't say a word. The emperor silently watched the lady's strange behavior, and all the guests were also a little stunned. And at this point, the heroine had no choice but to use the image of the real Liana to her advantage. And if problems arose, the heroine decided that the emperor should simply blame everything on her. She quietly asked him if she could try on the gloves later, confessing that her feet hurt terribly, and that she could no longer stand in one spot. After drinking a glass of wine in one gulp, Liana pretended to be drunk and asked the emperor to take her somewhere else. This was the only option that could distract the emperor from the gift, and she asked to do it as soon as possible. She believed he would respond to her request with lightning speed, and at the next second she felt his strong arms. In front of everyone, the girl found herself in the emperor's arms, who skillfully lifted her as if she were a feather. Liana asked what the emperor was doing, but he had just said that her legs hurt, and she couldn't walk. The heroine did not expect the emperor to carry her like that at all. She was sure that it would have been enough for him to simply walk with her. Addressing the prince, the young man stated that his precious beloved was bored, and it seemed she wouldn't be able to try on the gift right away. Smiling falsely, the prince admitted that, of course, he understood everything perfectly. Liana asked to be taken to a safe place, and drawing the curtains for the guests, she urgently asked to see her hand. She was worried that the emperor might feel cold or something, as he had just touched her. The girl became emotional, and the young man asked her to speak more slowly, promising her that he definitely wouldn't go anywhere. To begin with, they decided to sit down and simply catch their breath, and the heroine recounted the speech about the gloves from Prince Gamel's move. Indeed, there was something wrong with them, and the emperor realized that his sudden hug was just an attempt to stop him from wearing those gloves. Liana apologized. She was in a hurry and couldn't just say not to wear them without a good reason. So she decided to do just that. She put the emperor in an awkward position by creating such a scene, and even tears of despair appeared in her eyes. But she didn't want the young man to see her cry, and simply stated that she decided to sneeze. In any case, the heroine was incredibly worried about tarnishing His Majesty's reputation. Liana was supposed to play the role of a lover, but instead behaved childishly in front of all the aristocrats, and she understood that problems could arise due to today's incident. She promised to take full responsibility and fix everything, but the young man didn't want the lady to put herself in danger. I think I already said that he didn't have a reputation that could be so easily tarnished. However, this does not mean that the emperor is so powerless as to hide behind the backs of a fragile girl. After all, he was a majestic ruler, and asked her if she really thought he wouldn't be able to cope with such a situation. Enoch acted very confidently, and the lady realized that all this time she had actually been worrying in vain. Now all that remained was to explain why those gloves could not be used, and why such a strong spell was cast on them. Liana admitted that as soon as the emperor put on these gloves, his power would instantly run wild. She couldn't discuss it in front of strangers, so she had to make a ridiculous, childish scene. And as a quick fix, she created a stupid situation so that none of those present understood anything. The emperor asked exactly how the girl managed to find out that a terrible spell had been placed on the gloves. The prince's gift looked completely ordinary, and Enoch didn't even suspect that there could be anything wrong with them. Now he learned the terrible truth that all this time he hadn't even suspected that something was happening behind his back. They were talking about a mysterious curse, but the heroine couldn't admit that she was a time traveler who found out about it in a book. At that very moment, she had to somehow explain how she knew that the gloves had a terrible curse on them. The emperor asked again how the girl knew there was something strange about those gloves. He couldn't even believe that this was a real event that happened right at a charity event. On the outside, the gloves looked quite normal, with an exquisite leather texture, and a huge ruby stone in the center. He suggested that it was all right, and that if the girl found it difficult to explain, he would examine them himself. Liana asked if the emperor was not interested in knowing where she got all this information from. But Enoch replied with a categorical refusal, because he saw that it was very difficult for the lady to talk about this. And from the girl's agitated behavior, he realized that she didn't want to discuss it. And he was not going to insist. Liana was the only one who knew something that no one else knew, and that in itself was really incredibly strange. Looking fearfully at the emperor, the girl waited to see what he would do next. But the young man felt and believed that the girl would never harm him, and he was ready to solve the problem himself. She lowered her head and sadly asked him why he trusted people so easily. If many wished him harm. After all, if something arouses suspicion, the first thing to do is to doubt it and, first of all, conduct an interrogation. If your highness continues to blindly trust someone who tells you nothing, you may have big problems in the future. In response to her words, Enoch could only smile involuntarily while saying that one cannot trust people so easily. She even stated that, no matter what she does, he doesn't even know if she has secret intentions and evil ones. Deep in his heart, the emperor felt that Liana could not harm him, and he gently touched her hand. He asked her if she had such intentions, although he knew perfectly well that this was definitely not the case. And he tenderly asked if she really planned to wring his neck with those graceful hands and fragile ones. Liana was a little surprised by these words and stated that she never thought of harming him, and that she only wished him the best. For some reason, the emperor sincerely trusted her and knew that she was exactly like that, and that she would never hurt him. And for the lady's information, he admitted that he doesn't trust people so easily, and she was the first girl he treated that way. Enoch said confidently that he only trusted her, and that there was no other person he could talk to. The heroine didn't understand how he could say such embarrassing things so calmly. But the emperor suggested that they first figure out what kind of gloves those were. He was ready to listen to Liana when she was ready to share the information she was hiding so carefully. The heroine accepted all his conditions, and for some reason, a dark blue magical portal suddenly appeared in front of the emperor. The young man did not want the two to meet again, but he opened the magic portal for a reason. At the next second, he pulled the master of the magic tower out of the magic portal from his hair. Who did not expect such a sudden call? Aaron introduced himself to the hero and told him that what was happening was because he had not received any notification. Ileana did not expect to see the master of the magic tower here, who had recently bitten her on the neck. She supposed that this gentleman could give her information about the gloves and remembered very well that he and Ileana had crossed paths very recently. Aaron was indignant at this behavior and did not understand why he had been called so urgently. The young man was caught in the middle of a meal, and Liana asked him to cover his mouth so as not to see the chewed pieces of food. The master of the magic tower was disgusted, because one way or another even dogs are not touched during meals, and he was unexpectedly dragged here. The emperor gently tapped him on the head and asked him to apologize first, but the master was sure that his majesty was constantly annoying him. He warned him that if he refused, the agreement regarding the magic tower would be cancelled. so Harun immediately understood his threatening intentions. There was nothing to do. He apologized to the girl for that bite on the neck, and admitted that at those moments, his mind simply shuts off. The master of the magic tower promised not to do that again as soon as he remembered how he got it from the emperor in one bite. The emperor smiled and asked Aaron to stop his stupid speeches. Although his bruises had not yet disappeared from the last time, the two acted like real children, and the lady decided to intervene by saying that she was curious about something. She realized that the characters seemed very close and were definitely connected by some kind of commercial relationship. The master of the magic tower said that this was not entirely true, but the heroine understood that they definitely knew each other for a long time. Aaron did not address the emperor formally, and therefore the lady thought that there might be some kind of friendship between them. The emperor stated that this was because the gentleman was not entirely familiar with human etiquette, and no matter how many times he told him, he didn't even think of learning it. It was a matter of human etiquette, but the owner of the magic tower was a magical being for whom it was very difficult. Aaron was a fox beast man, and his animal instincts were stronger than human ones, so he could be extremely rude. The heroine did not remember anything like this being mentioned about the fox in the novel. The owner of the magic tower looked like a man, but in essence he was an animal. Filled with joy, the young man even offered to show his true appearance. But to be honest, the emperor was not particularly interested. At the next second, the master of the magic tower, Aaron, turned into a snow-white magic fox. The transformation was instantaneous and complete, leaving no trace of the stardust-covered robe. Harun, already in fox form, gracefully stepped with his paw on the marble floor, leaving a barely perceptible glittering trail on it. Only his fluffy, shimmering white fur, piercing scarlet eyes, and an aura of supernatural power revealed him as the ancient ruler of these lands. The scarlet, piercing, wise eyes burned with an inner light that reflected infinite knowledge and incomprehensible power. The master of the magic tower knew that he looked dazzling, but according to the heroine, the novel mentions that he looked like an ordinary half-breed. Usually, the young man did not show his true form to just anyone. The fox Aaron was the embodiment of silent grace, mortal danger, and mysterious beauty. Aaron admitted that since the girl was loved by the emperor, he made an exception for her today. Now that he was in his fox form, he could feel it much more clearly, and the girl really smelled delicious. Harun admitted that for some reason he hadn't noticed it before and that there were probably reasons for it. The fox wondered if the lady had ever lent her power to someone, but that was impossible, and if a power of such magnitude were given to another person, that person would become intoxicated by temptation and lose their mind forever. Liana stated that she hadn't borrowed any power and had no idea what the magic fox was talking about. The emperor threw the glove at the magic animal because the fox did not respond to the girl's requests to stay away from her. Enoch once again warned the master of the magic tower to stay away from the lady with his paws and never do something like that again. Liana understood everything perfectly, but seeing how the emperor threw the glove at him, he asked if it was possible to allow him to be tormented in this way. The glove appeared in the mouth of the magic fox at lightning speed and began to crush it as if it were a tasty bone. The emperor was sure that it was the recipient of the gift who should decide how to use it, and he did not oppose the master of the magic tower. Suddenly, Liana saw an icy look, almost like that of the tyrannical emperor from the novel. The fox finished chewing the glove and stated that it must have been difficult to obtain such a high-quality mana stone. The emperor said it was a gift from the prince of the kingdom as a sign of friendship, and he asked if there was anything strange about it. It is not surprising that this stone was extracted from their region, and the fox initially even assumed that there was nothing unusual about it. Except for one thing, the glove had an incredibly disgusting smell stuck to it that could not be confused with anything else. Immediately after the gift was presented, the prince tried to hide from the sight of those present to think about what was happening. What he feared most was that this time he was really about to be caught, because he kept too many secrets. The young man thought that after several years, he would finally see something interesting that would arouse his cold feelings. And he had definitely come to the charity event for a reason, and now he was surprised how the girl had managed to find something out. The young man cast a perfect spell, so perfect that the emperor wouldn't even notice the trick. Yes, Lady Harrington mentioned that her sister had become strange lately, and she seemed somehow different, not at all like before. Without a doubt, the young man himself was convinced that Liana Daphne had changed a lot, and a completely different aura emanated from her. The one who once had one foot in the grave not only came back to life, but also got involved in the very curious affairs of the emperor. The young man supposed that over time, he might find out the reason for her sudden change. But for now, other matters awaited him. After all, he had plenty of time, because the prince was not at all what he claimed to be. A few days later, after a small commotion, the heroes arrived at the banquet hall again. And this time, Liana clearly realized that the prince was making her feel uncomfortable. She sat quietly behind the bushes and observed Karjal's behavior. At that moment, the emperor approached her, closing his eyes. He asked who the girl was watching so attentively, and she was definitely not just sitting among the bushes. He realized that she seemed to be watching the prince, but she had no bad intentions. Liana was just sure that something was wrong with this glove. To be honest, she couldn't trust this man at all. After apologizing for burdening the emperor with unverified information, the lady decided to check something. Moreover, the master of the magic tower did not agree to examine the glove in more detail. And certainly not like that, because he was right. The emperor asked, "The lady is always full of energy, running around everywhere." But for some reason, she was completely annoyed by such a trifle now. The emperor didn't particularly like this Prince Karjal, and he felt it too. He learned that originally, the crown prince was supposed to be the head of the delegation, but that the kingdom's delegation was headed by Prince Karjal. It turned out that not only did they suddenly change the head of the delegation, but they also installed a completely different person as the ruler. It turned out to be the second prince, who had never shown himself in public, and this was quite strange. In theory, they should have chosen a man who often appeared in social circles and participated in public activities, but the prince was not like that. It was at least strange to hear this, although from the beginning the heroine seemed extremely suspicious. Therefore, the emperor was sure that the girl's suspicions towards him were probably not unfounded. Since he thought exactly the same, it was no coincidence that he was named ruler. And evidently, some mystery is hidden here. To ease the tension and the situation a little, the emperor took a small flower leaf. He carefully inserted it into the heroine's hair and admitted that she was incredibly beautiful, and that this small, cute flower suited her very well. Liana was startled by such closeness and asked them to move away from each other. But Enoch asked her why they should do that. She couldn't explain much, but she tried to follow the plot of the novel as best she could so as not to spoil anything. But at that moment, the guests continued to look at them, and it seemed that there were more and more people. In any case, they would scorn the heroine for the trouble she caused, but the emperor asked the girl not to worry about it anymore. The human brain is simpler than it seems. It tends to remember only the most sensational things. During this time, the heroes became much closer, and Liana didn't quite understand what the emperor's words meant. He meant that in the perception of those people, neither the fact that the prince presented the gift, nor the fact that she intercepted it, would definitely not remain in memory in the future. Soon people will forget everything. None of this will be remembered, and it makes no sense to worry about trifles. Instead, the emperor, delighted by his beautiful companion, simply threw the gift away and disappeared, embracing his beloved, and this will become that main topic and long-awaited topic of discussion. The emperor laughed, as he had already been given a new nickname, the love-struck fool, because he had indeed behaved strangely then. However, he believed that this was the best nickname and the most amusing one he had heard, and it certainly couldn't destroy the entire empire and his authority. In fact, Liana felt sorry and thought that, at worst, rumors would spread criticizing her for the trouble she caused. What surprised her most was who came up with that nickname, and she was glad that the young man was not at all angry with her. Enoch continued to laugh, while the heroine was indignant about who dared to call His Majesty the Emperor a love-struck fool. He looked into her eyes particularly closely and asked her to put aside all her worries. And indeed, the reaction of the people was not as bad as the girl imagined. Looking at the guests, she really saw that none of them looked at her inappropriately, and the atmosphere was favorable. The emperor admitted that the behavior of the guests was entirely his fault. Although Liana didn't understand what she had to do with it, the attitude towards the emperor had changed. He was no longer the same as when he got furious if someone touched him, so the nickname Love-Struck Fool is much more appropriate and endearing. Wanting to know the girl's opinion, the emperor carefully asked her what she thought about this matter. Liana realized it, but lately he seemed incredibly calm and happy. and she was glad that her actions had not caused him any trouble. In the long run, they are doomed to become strangers to each other. But now the heroine wonders if all this is okay. If the heroes continue to foster fake relationships for those around them, then maybe everything can change. The void that will remain in Enoch's life with her disappearance is the void that will remain in her life without the Emperor. And perhaps if we reach such a scale, then there will definitely be no turning back. And in the future, this could create many problems. Liana spoke about her experiences, but the Emperor did not understand what problems could arise. After all, if it comes to this, the lives of both heroes can change for the better and more pleasant. Looking into his sincere eyes, the girl understood that the connection between them was growing stronger every day. The lady could not control her emotions and only found one way out that could calm her down. With a movement of her white dress, she admitted that she wanted to leave and just get some fresh air. She left without answering, and the Emperor looked at her sadly, calling the girl by her name. Unfortunately, the young man could not understand why this fragile and strange lady behaved this way. As if sooner or later she had to disappear one day, without a trace, irrevocably. And forever, the heroine left for a secluded spot so that the Emperor would not see her. Tears of despair appeared in her eyes. She did not understand why His Majesty always spoke like that, and much of what he said was incomprehensible to her. It is true that the Emperor always chose words that caused misunderstandings, and each time he said incredibly serious things with complete naturalness. In that conversation, he suggested simply becoming empress, but if she did not want to be empress, she could even become a great emperor. Liana was worried that anyone who could hear his speech would think that she actually liked him incredibly much. The heroine didn't even realize she was saying it out loud, and Enoch was simply kind by nature, and she was not imagining too much. The girl firmly decided to pull herself together, and was sure that the young man would consider her ridiculous if he found out about her stupid thoughts. She got up from the table and felt a sharp pain in her leg, on which a red callus was visible, but she needed to follow Cargill to find out the truth. As she applied a white handkerchief to the wound, the heroine suddenly heard someone realize that they were definitely talking about him. Recognizing that voice, she immediately understood everything, and the prince passed by. She heard his name and decided to approach. Thus they met again. The young man stated that the heroine had been hanging around him all the time in recent days, and he was absolutely sure of it. Liana replied that he had misunderstood everything and that their paths had simply crossed by chance. But the prince definitely did not agree with her opinion. He saw drops of blood running down the girl's leg and decided to examine the wound, asking her if she had really been interested in him all this time. After the charity banquet, Cargill thought about Liana for a long time and also wanted to know something about her. For some reason, this man now seemed charming and sweet, but Liana understood that under no circumstances should she fall for such tricks. The prince examined her leg to make sure the wound was not serious, while Liana silently watched the strange man touch her leg. He accidentally pressed directly on the swollen wound, and Liana involuntarily even cried out in pain. She felt it was too rude to touch someone without permission, even though her leg was very swollen. Having firmly expressed her intention for the prince to immediately withdraw his hands, the heroine felt a very strong pain. She admitted that whatever the condition of her leg, Cargill should not worry about it, or he doesn't know that unilateral contact can be unpleasant. The young man laughed and said, "Imagine, the lady herself followed him with those legs and was probably attracted to him." He still hadn't let go of her leg, while Liana tried her best to pull it away, and she had already ordered him to let go several times. But suddenly, she felt something strange, as if a powerful energy began to float around the prince. And for some reason, he asked the girl not to move anymore. At that moment, the heroine was really very scared because she didn't understand what was happening. She only felt an unpleasant sensation, as if all strength suddenly left her body. And that was very unpleasant. Not understanding why this was happening, Liana even thought that perhaps the alcohol she had drunk earlier was only now beginning to take effect. The prince leaned closer and closer to her face, and suddenly suggested talking about how the girl managed to uncover the terrible secret. Liana was so dizzy that she didn't want to talk at all, so she pushed him away and took herself away, asking him never to do that again. She was definitely not ready to sit quietly like a doll and tolerate everything the gentleman allowed himself to do and say. Finally, after a couple of seconds, she could breathe freely again. and she asked why the prince dared to lean shamelessly close to her face. The stunned young man asked why the lady was reacting like that, and if there was something wrong with her face. Although the prince was handsome, in the eyes of Liana, who was used to seeing the emperor every day, he was like an empty space. She asked him to release her leg again, and declared that she could no longer tolerate such rudeness. The prince smiled and asked the girl to answer, promising that only in that case would he withdraw his hands. Everything was too exhausting, and the heroine didn't care at all whether it was the prince or anyone else in front of her, so she said she really needed to explain the reason. The girl asked him to stop and leave, but unfortunately the prince didn't even suspect that the emperor was heading straight for him. Finally, he let go of her leg and told her that if the lady was interested in something about him, she could feel free to approach at any time. And it seems he decided to stay here for a long time to find out what secrets the stranger hides. Liana looked threateningly at the prince and said nothing in response, but she knew perfectly well that something like this would definitely not happen soon. She went to the emperor and told him that the prince was quite strange and was behaving inappropriately. Before this, Liana had decided to run there barefoot, but she was so happy that she even forgot to put on the shoes she had brought with her. The emperor found her behavior amusing and sweet, and the girl walked barefoot on the grass, holding her shoes in her hands. Suddenly, she felt the touch of a man's hand on her waist, and in a second she blushed like a ripe cherry. And bright, the emperor asked the lady to stand up in her shoes and offered to go inside immediately. It was child's play, and Liana hadn't done it for a long time, but she had done it often as a child. Enoch asked who she was doing this to, if to Marquis Daphne, who was rumored to be an incredibly gloomy man. In fact, the heroine didn't even really remember her parents from the previous world, and she asked if they would really continue like this. She was worried about stepping on her expensive shoes, but the emperor didn't care at all at that moment. He asked why that scoundrel Cargill was next to her at the moment she was approaching, and she was sitting completely alone before that. Enoch began to worry. Perhaps the prince could tell the girl something, or, even worse, do something. Liana said that the prince did not do any of that, but she knew that she had been stalking him for several days. She was sure that she had been hiding very well all this time, and that no one should have noticed her, especially the prince himself. She also admitted that the young man asked if the girl was interested in him, and tried to find out why she was following him. She did not keep it a secret. The prince openly admitted that he was interested in her, and the emperor did not like it very much. Moreover, he touched her leg without permission, but Liana warned him, trying in every way to push him away. The emperor had to strain to hold back the curses that poured down in torrents. Furthermore, the prince said that he would most likely stay there for a long time, and that Liana could come to see him at a convenient time. What worried the heroine most was that Cargill was getting so close to her, and everything was disgusting. If it weren't for the contract, she would have ripped all his hair out. Suddenly, the girl heard a strange crunch, and realized that at that moment the emperor clenched his fist so tightly that something inside it crumbled. Enoch's expression instantly changed, and now he wanted to know what else that scoundrel had dared to say. The prince said nothing more, and just as the heroine realized it, the emperor crushed the stone with his bare hand. This couldn't have just happened. The girl understood that something in her words had probably enraged the emperor. Fearing she had said something wrong, the lady fell silent while the young man continued to kneel before her, and remained silent. In the palace, the maids were busy with the banquet, and suddenly a female voice was heard in the huge hall asking the emperor to let them go. Enoch carried the girl in his arms because all her feet were covered in abrasions, and her leg was very swollen. He tried to be considerate and asked the lady to simply remain in his arms, and not to resist the topic because he wouldn't let her go anyway. The heroine supposed that perhaps she had indeed made a mistake, but she didn't even know what she had said wrong. What she feared most was that one of the servants would see what was happening and would again think that Enoch was just a stupid, love-struck emperor. At that moment, he was forcing the girl to act in such a way that all the palace courtiers could see exactly that. The emperor was confident that this would make perfectly clear to all those closest to him. That terrifying and cold look appeared on his face again, but the sweet smile was what suited the young man best. At that moment, the emperor was about to take the girl to the bath, but at first she was incredibly happy when she thought of hot water. The next second, the heroine suffered an uncomfortable misunderstanding, as it was unclear why the emperor was taking her there. She screamed throughout the palace because the emperor decided to take her to the bath, as it was too strange a place to spend time together. It turned out to be much simpler, and he just wanted to wash the dirty wound on her leg to prevent infection. At that moment, the young man seemed very worried, and every second asked how much the swollen wound hurt. He even warned that he would be very careful, and asked the lady to be patient for a little while to wash the wound. So, the young man took her to the bath to treat the wound, and Liana kept telling herself not to be carried away by illusions. And she found it strange that the emperor himself was washing her feet. Suddenly, he said out loud that even goldfish had much better memory than hers. And his words sounded strange. Enoch looked at the lady and asked what she meant, while she denied having said anything serious. The young man warned that next time he would definitely tell the maid to prepare more comfortable shoes, and without heels, so that she would not get such terrible blisters again. Carefully washing the wound, the young man admitted that she was always beautiful and radiant even without heels. His words were true, and the heroine wondered how someone could say something like that without even thinking. She became more and more embarrassed with every passing second, and asked the young man to stop saying such sweet words. Enoch's peculiarity was that he was completely incapable of lying, and always told the truth to one's face. There was a warm and pleasant conversation between them, and having relaxed a little, Liana asked him if he really wasn't angry with her. In reality, Enoch was not angry about anything. He was of sound mind, and did not understand why he should be angry with her. For some reason, the heroine felt that the emperor would be angry about her behavior, but he never said a rude word to her. Although something similar happened in the carriage when she was trying to find out if he was feeling unwell. So she decided to clarify the situation if the emperor was upset because the prince touched her leg. Because in the carriage, she promised that no one would touch her again, but this time he really didn't touch her. The emperor carefully treated the wound, and last time his soul was truly burning with jealousy. And now he understood why Enoch was sad, and it was worth mentioning that Carol touched her leg. But she firmly stated that this time she did not touch anyone at all, and it was the prince who touched her without asking. Enoch perfectly understood that this time, the lady was indifferent and he couldn't do anything in that situation. Still, just thinking about it made him feel bad, and he didn't like it at all. Gently touching her leg, Enoch asked her if she remembered what he had told her in the carriage that day, and what promise she had made. Then the young man confessed that Liana was the only one for him, the one he could touch and feel something pleasant. And now, the young man was sure that he wanted to become that person for Liana, and he admitted it sincerely. His strong and masculine hands touched her leg, and the emperor admitted that he incredibly enjoyed touching her, and simply staying close. He noticed such small things as, for example, what a girl wanted to do or eat, and these small happy things were enough for him. He touched her knee with his cheek, looking into her eyes, and sincerely told her that he would like to be the first and the only one, in everything, in every second of life, in every day that he touches, only her delicate skin. Enoch asked not to allow anyone else to be close to him, and the moment he saw her, and the prince, feelings of anger overwhelmed him. It was really extremely dangerous, and the young man only wanted the girl to always be by his side. In the carriage, she promised that he would be the only one who could touch her, and at that moment, Liana noticed that the young man's voice trembled, but he was only touching her leg. The girl's heart pounded hard in her chest, the emperor's gaze echoing in her ears, so penetrating and tender at the same time. It penetrated the deepest and most hidden corners of her soul. Stepping onto the cold marble, Liana felt her cheeks burn. He was the emperor, and she only a traveler from a novel, and she had no idea what he saw in her. Her sudden concern made her lose her composure, like a frightened animal. She ran away from the heat and comfort towards the unknown. Suddenly, Liana shouted Ariel's name, splashing the emperor with water, and the young man certainly did not expect such a turn of events. She ran to the door, declaring that it was time to return to the estate, as the baby would soon be asleep. Liana tried to stop the trembling in her arms and legs, but her heart continued to beat wildly in her chest. She didn't understand why she was reacting this way. Perhaps it was fear of a strong man, or an unusual feeling of tenderness to which she didn't know how to respond. Or maybe it was something else, something dangerous, which made her run to save herself from herself. But the emperor grabbed her hand, and together they fell into a large bath of water that splashed everywhere and soaked the walls. For a moment, Liana froze, surprised by the unexpected situation, as warm drops of water ran down her face. The water was warm and silky to the touch, and all the heroes' clothes were soaked. Liana started to laugh, unable to stop, either because of the awkwardness of the situation, or because of the overwhelming relief, or because of the sudden feeling of freedom she hadn't experienced for a long time. Drops of water ran down her cheeks, mixing with tears of laughter. Enoch carefully hugged the girl, and no matter what, she definitely couldn't run away from him now. The world around them seemed to cease to exist, and only the two of them remained in the bath, filled with the scent of roses. Liana felt her heart beating faster and faster, anticipating something new and unknown. And holding her wet hair in his hand, the Emperor asked her again what her answer would be. His touch was light, almost weightless, but it sent a wave of warmth through Liana's body. She froze, looking into his eyes, and the laughter gradually faded, giving way to something deeper and more complex. Liana assumed she looked like a drowned rat, but it turned out she was cornered. Enoch, sitting with wet clothes, confessed to the girl that she could take her time with her answer. However, he hoped that Liana's answer would be positive, and she would agree to become his companion. After this sentence, the Emperor headed for the door, while the stunned lady continued to look at him. She thought he would leave at that moment, but at that moment a white towel and soft appeared over her head. Carefully drying her wet head, the young man confessed that the lady had broken her promise, a promise not to touch anyone but him. Liana was perplexed, because Prince Cargill did it on his own initiative, and she didn't even put a finger on him. The Emperor blocked her way, and on the one hand, he was very mean, and on the other very sweet. But nothing could be done, and a promise is a promise. And just as he promised, the girl will still have to fulfill the Emperor's wish. Without even suspecting what wish the young man was talking about, the lady set out to listen to him attentively. But after these words, she suddenly fell silent, standing with her bare feet in the warm water. And pleasant, he continued to dry her with a towel, and told her that he would definitely tell her. But a little later, Liana asked how grand the wish the young man would ask for this time would be. She had absolutely no money, and of course, could not buy him any expensive gifts. But Enoch had always been a little greedy, and this time he was not greedy at all when it came to finances. For Liana, this information remained a mystery, and she couldn't even imagine what the Emperor would want. After this conversation, they decided to return to the room so that at this rate, no one would catch a cold. The Emperor had already learned about little Ariel and said that she had gone for a walk with the elders, and she was expected to return soon. He entered the room and wanted to tell Liana, but something incredibly cute appeared before his eyes. The girl, dressed in a warm terry robe, was sitting on the sofa. Her eyes were closed, and it was clear that she was deeply asleep. It was the Emperor's room, and he couldn't help but be touched because the lady looked very defenseless, since she didn't even wake up when he entered, but realized that he simply needed to lay her down. Probably after the hot bath, Liana relaxed, and after so many worries, she finally fell into a deep sleep. It seemed that she was really sleeping soundly, and there was nothing to do, so the young man decided to act. Finally, he was sure that the beautiful lady needed to sleep comfortably, and gently touched her shoulders. Liana didn't even wake up when the young man picked her up and walked carefully to his bedroom. He laid her on a soft pillow and covered her with a feather blanket so that the lady would be warm and comfortable, and he lay down next to her and couldn't take his eyes off her sweet face, which even in sleep looked incredibly beautiful. A light touch like a breath of wind, almost imperceptible, but leaving a trace of warmth and restlessness on the skin. Enoch kept his gaze fixed on her, as if afraid to disturb that moment of peace. And tranquility, usually authoritarian and unflappable, now seemed vulnerable, almost helpless. Something akin to tenderness shone in the depths of his dark eyes, a feeling he had suppressed for so long, considering it a weakness. As expected, Liana was cute. Even without elegant shoes, without jewelry, she radiated light. The Emperor realized that this woman, who had fallen asleep in his bed, was capable of changing his life, breaking the boundaries he had so carefully built around himself. He wondered why Eliana always assumed the ending. She had said more than once that, when the ice in his heart melted, he could return to normal life. She spoke of the end of the play, that they would no longer be in love, and that at that moment they were together only out of necessity. And Enoch was lost, and when the play ended, they would never see each other again, but he was beginning to feel something. The reason his heart beat faster when he saw this girl was not just a physical reaction. The young man thought that he was only now vaguely beginning to understand the true nature of that feeling, and he couldn't believe that all this could end. and it hurt him that Liana continued to draw a clear line between them, assuring him that everything would come to an end. He was prepared for these changes and was ready to let love and trust into his life. But many questions tormented his soul. Caressing her soft skin, the young man thought of only one thing: what was he doing now? And what was happening to him? At first, it was enough for the emperor to have dinner with someone else, but with Liana, everything was different. It was pleasant for him just to hold hands, to feel that warmth with every cell of his frozen soul. And during all this time, he was very happy, simply enjoying everyday life, spending time together. They say that human greed has no limits, and now the emperor realized that this was indeed true. And he would like the girl's heart to beat in unison with his, and dreamed that she would look at him with the same affection with which he looked at her. But for some reason, every day that passed, the craving for sensations continued to grow. And every day that passed, he wanted to spend more and more time with her. Enoch realized that he wanted her to see him not as a patient who needed medicine, but as a person, so that she would see in him a truly strong man, for whom she would feel weak. And now this girl, so incredible, was sleeping sweetly in his bed, and he couldn't stop looking at her. Liana murmured something in her sleep. What happened before was very unfair. And now that she was close, that he could touch her skin, he was afraid that this dream would end, that she would disappear like the morning mist. He carefully sat up, leaning on his elbow, and looked at her face. There was only calmness there, serenity, like the surface of a mirror lake in the hour before dawn. Enoch hugged the girl, and in that silence, he was ready to promise himself that he would do everything possible to protect her and preserve the world of her fragile happiness. He slowly sank onto the pillow, snuggling closer to her, wishing that this moment would last forever. But he believed that if you wish hard enough and put all your effort in, you can reach any star. She was his star, and Enoch felt ready to put aside his principles, willing to fight for his love, willing to give everything just to see the reciprocal feeling of love in her eyes.